Around 74,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption in what is now Indonesia released enormous amounts of ash into the atmosphere, changing the climate over a wide region of the Earth. For a period of time, temperatures may have dropped, environments may have shifted, and many ecosystems were likely affected. Some scientists have suggested that human populations could have been reduced during this period, leaving only a small number of surviving groups scattered across different regions. This idea is still debated, but it raises a quiet possibility that human continuity was not always guaranteed. Survival may not have come from strength alone, but from a combination of timing, environment, and small, uncertain advantages. If conditions had been slightly different, the outcome might not have been the same. So what allowed humans to continue through a period that may have narrowed their presence so severely? Why did humans almost go extinct 74,000 years ago? Long before any single event is considered, the presence of humans on Earth was already shaped by a quiet instability that is easy to overlook when looking back from the present. Early human groups did not exist as a continuous population spread evenly across a landscape. Instead, they were small, scattered, and often separated by long distances of unfamiliar terrain. Each group lived within a narrow range of conditions that allowed them to move, find food, and remain together across generations. Beyond that range, survival became less certain, not because of a single threat, but because the balance between the human body and the environment was delicate and easily disrupted. The body itself had limits that had been formed over long periods of earlier evolution, long before this moment in time. It depended on regular access to food, on manageable temperatures, and on a landscape that could be read and remembered. These conditions were not always stable. In many regions, small shifts in climate could change the availability of plants and animals, alter migration patterns, or reshape water sources in ways that were not immediately predictable. For a small group of humans, even a gradual change could begin to reduce the margin for error, narrowing the space in which life could continue without interruption. This is where the beginning of the story takes shape, not in a sudden collapse, but in a world where continuity already depended on conditions that could not be controlled. The archaeological record, though incomplete, suggests that early human presence was not constant across all regions. There are places where evidence appears and then disappears, not necessarily because humans left intentionally, but because the conditions that supported their presence may have changed. In these patterns, it becomes possible to see how fragile continuity could be. A group could exist in one area for many generations, adapting slowly to its surroundings, only to find that a shift in climate or resources required movement into unfamiliar territory. Movement itself carried risks. It meant leaving behind known paths, known sources of water, and known seasonal patterns. It required encountering new environments where the same strategies might not work in the same way. The human body, while capable of adaptation over long periods, could not adjust quickly enough to sudden or repeated changes. This created a situation where survival was not a fixed state, but something that had to be maintained continuously, generation after generation, without interruption. If that continuity broke, even briefly, a group could disappear without leaving a clear trace. Over time, this led to a pattern in which human populations were both present and absent across different regions, not as a unified whole but as a collection of small, independent lines of continuity. Each of these lines carried only a part of the larger human story, shaped by local conditions and limited by local constraints. When thinking about what happened around 74,000 years ago, it is important to begin from this point, because it suggests that human survival was never guaranteed. Even before any major environmental disruption occurred, the conditions that allowed humans to remain present were already narrow, already dependent on factors that could shift beyond control. In this sense, the question is not only how humans survived a particular event, but how they were able to remain present at all within a world that did not always provide stable ground for that presence to continue, before any rare or dramatic event is considered. It is useful to remain with the quieter pattern that shaped human life over long stretches of time. Early human groups did not move through a stable world that could be relied upon from one season to the next. Instead, they lived within shifting landscapes where small variations could accumulate and gradually alter the conditions of survival. Rainfall could become less predictable, vegetation could thin or move, and animals that once followed familiar routes could begin to change their patterns. These changes were not always sudden, and often they were not immediately visible. They unfolded slowly, across years and generations, making it difficult for any single group to recognize that the environment itself was becoming less supportive. The human body, adapted over much longer evolutionary timescales, responded best to consistency. It relied on repeated patterns that could be learned and remembered, allowing individuals to anticipate where food might be found or when certain resources would become available. When those patterns began to shift, even slightly, the knowledge passed from one generation to the next became less reliable. This did not mean immediate failure, but it reduced the margin within which errors could be corrected. Over time, this narrowing margin could place increasing pressure on small groups, especially those already living near the limits of what their environment could provide. In some regions, archaeological evidence suggests periods where human presence becomes sparse or disappears altogether, only to return later under different conditions. These gaps do not necessarily point to sudden catastrophes, but they do reflect a pattern in which continuity was fragile and dependent on circumstances that could change without warning. The ability to move was one way humans responded to these pressures, but movement itself required energy, knowledge, and a degree of predictability about what lay ahead. Entering a new landscape meant facing unfamiliar climates, unfamiliar resources, and unfamiliar risks. The body could not immediately adjust to these differences, and so survival depended on how closely the new environment resembled the old one. When differences were too great, adaptation could not keep pace. This creates a picture of early human life that is not defined by a single dramatic struggle, but by a continuous negotiation with changing conditions. Each generation inherited not only the physical traits of those before them, but also the limits within which those traits could function. If those limits were exceeded, even gradually the line could begin to thin. This process did not leave clear markers in the way that a sudden event might. Instead, it appears as a quiet reduction in presence, a fading of activity in places where humans had once been. When considering the period around 74,000 years ago, this background becomes essential. It suggests that human populations were already living within narrow ecological boundaries, where stability was not guaranteed and continuity depended on the alignment between body, knowledge, and environment. In such a context, even a modest additional pressure could have effects that extended far beyond its immediate cause, not by creating entirely new challenges, but by amplifying those that were already present and unresolved. The deeper problem facing early humans was not simply danger in the immediate sense, but the structure of their population itself. Human beings around this period were not gathered into large, dense populations that could easily absorb loss and continue unchanged. They were spread across wide distances in small groups, connected only loosely, if at all, by movement over land that was often difficult to cross. This meant that survival did not depend only on whether individuals could endure hardship. It also depended on whether enough people remained, in enough places, for generations to continue without interruption. A species can appear present across a broad region and still be vulnerable if that presence is thin, scattered, and uneven. In such a situation, loss does not need to be dramatic to matter. A few difficult seasons, the disappearance of a water source, the failure of familiar food patterns, or the movement of animals away from a known range, could all reduce the number of people in a local group. When the group was already small, such reductions were not merely temporary hardships. They could change the future of that line entirely. Fewer adults meant less shared knowledge, fewer cooperative bonds, and a narrower margin for caring for children through periods of stress. Fewer children reaching maturity meant that continuity itself became uncertain. This is one of the quiet ways human existence could narrow long before any single event is described as catastrophic. The weakness was built into the spacing of populations across the landscape. One group might persist, while another nearby, or perhaps not even very nearby, might disappear completely, leaving no memory except the silence of an abandoned place. From the perspective of deep time, this matters because the human story was not carried by one uninterrupted body of people moving together through history. It was carried by many separate lines, each exposed to local conditions, each dependent on its own fragile sequence of births, survival, and transmission. The body alone could not protect against this. Human intelligence alone could not solve it. What mattered was whether enough continuity remained across enough generations for presence to endure. Archaeology cannot always show these absences clearly, but population structure helps explain why human survival in the past must be thought of as a demographic question as much as an environmental one. A harsh world did not need to destroy all humans at once. It only needed to reduce enough groups, in enough places, that the wider pattern of human presence became thinner and less secure. Around the beginning of our species, this kind of thinning may have happened more than once in different forms. The important point is not that every region suffered equally, or that every group faced the same pressures, but that small populations always carry a special kind of risk. They can survive for long periods under stable conditions, yet they are less able to recover when stability weakens. A larger population can lose some part of itself and still continue with much of its knowledge and structure intact. A smaller one may not have that reserve. When thinking about the period before the eruption associated with Toba enters the picture directly, this becomes essential to remember. Humans were not standing on firm numerical ground, waiting for an external shock. They were already living as a lightly distributed species, held together by local continuity rather than by strength in numbers. That meant the line between persistence and disappearance was never wide. It could narrow quietly, across generations, until survival itself depended not on power, but on whether enough separate human lines remained connected to time. Long before any single eruption or sudden disruption is placed at the center of attention, it is necessary to consider the broader patterns of climate that shaped the world in which early humans lived. The Earth during this period was not stable in the way it might appear when viewed from a modern perspective. Instead, it moved through long cycles of cooling and warming, often referred to as glacial and interglacial phases, driven by natural variations in the planet's orbit and other large-scale environmental systems. These changes did not occur all at once, and they were not experienced in the same way everywhere. In some regions, temperatures might shift gradually over many generations. In others, rainfall patterns could become less predictable, leading to changes in vegetation and water availability that were difficult to anticipate. For human groups already living within narrow ecological limits, these changes did not need to be extreme to have consequences. Even modest shifts could alter the balance between what the environment could provide and what the human body required. This meant that survival was not simply a matter of enduring a single difficult event, but of maintaining continuity within a system that was always in motion. The body itself was shaped by earlier conditions, by climates and landscapes that had existed over long periods before this moment. It could adapt, but only slowly, and only within certain bounds. When conditions moved outside those bounds, the strategies that had once supported survival could begin to lose their effectiveness. Hunting patterns that relied on predictable animal movement could fail if those animals changed their routes or declined in number. Knowledge of seasonal plant growth could become less useful if rainfall no longer followed familiar cycles. Water sources, which often formed the backbone of human settlement patterns, could shift or diminish, forcing groups to move or to compete more intensely for what remained. These pressures were not evenly distributed. Some areas may have remained relatively stable, offering refuges where human life could continue with fewer disruptions. Other regions may have become more difficult, reducing the number of people who could remain there over time. This unevenness created a landscape in which human presence was constantly being reshaped, not by a single force, but by a combination of interacting conditions. Archaeological and environmental evidence suggests that such variability was a persistent feature of the late Pleistocene, the period in which early Homo sapiens lived. Layers of sediment, pollen records, and other indirect traces point to environments that shifted in ways that would have been experienced differently depending on location. For a species already spread thinly across large areas, this meant that there was no single, shared experience of the world. One group might encounter a series of relatively stable seasons, while another, not too far away, might face increasing uncertainty. This difference matters when thinking about continuity. Survival did not depend only on the average condition of the planet, but on the local conditions that each group faced. When those local conditions became less predictable, the margin for maintaining life narrowed. In this context, the idea of a world that could change without warning is not a dramatic exaggeration. but a reflection of how environmental systems operate over long periods of time. Changes could accumulate slowly, making them difficult to recognize until their effects were already being felt. By the time a pattern became clear, it might already have reduced the stability on which human life depended. This creates a background in which any additional disruption, even one that might seem moderate in isolation, could interact with existing pressures in ways that were difficult to anticipate. The question then becomes not only what happened during a specific event, but how that event entered a world that was already in motion, already shifting, and already placing quiet demands on the continuity of human life. What made this changing world especially difficult for early humans was not only that climate could shift, but that these shifts often move through the basic structure of the landscape itself. Climate is easy to imagine as temperature alone, yet for human life, its deeper effect is usually indirect. A cooler period can shorten growing seasons. A drier period can reduce plant cover and alter the movement of grazing animals. A change in rainfall can affect rivers, marshes, and shallow lakes that once gave a region its rhythm. For a small human group, these are not abstract environmental details. They form the difference between a place that can support repeated return and a place that slowly becomes harder to trust. This matters because early humans did not live in a world where food and water were stored against long stretches of uncertainty in the way later agricultural societies could manage. Their survival remained closely tied to what the surrounding environment could still provide within walking distance, within memory, and within the body's physical limits. When the land itself began to change, even without violence or sudden collapse, the human relationship to place became less secure. The same valley could look familiar, but function differently. The same route could still be there, but lead to diminished water or thinner animal presence. Over time, these changes weakened one of the most important tools available to early humans: reliable expectation. Human beings are deeply shaped by the ability to learn recurring patterns. The body conserves energy when the world behaves in ways that can be anticipated. Knowledge passed across generations becomes useful because conditions remain similar enough for older experience to guide newer movement. Once that consistency weakens, the value of inherited knowledge also begins to weaken. This does not mean people suddenly become incapable. It means each decision contains a little more uncertainty than before. A landscape known for abundance may no longer provide enough. A route remembered as safe may now carry greater risk. In that way, climate variability enters human life not only through hunger or cold, but through the erosion of confidence in the environment itself. Around the origin and early spread of our species, this would have mattered deeply, because human groups were still relatively few, widely distributed, and closely tied to local ecological knowledge. They did not stand above the environment as planners of a larger system. They lived inside it, and their continuity depended on repeated success within the narrow range of conditions the body could manage. Environmental records from the late Pleistocene suggest this broader instability was not exceptional but normal. Wet phases and dry phases did not simply alternate in a neat way. Their timing and local effects could vary, and what was favorable for one region could create pressure in another. This unevenness helps explain why human presence in the archaeological record can seem irregular. Groups may have remained in some places while thinning out in others, not because one population was fundamentally superior, but because local conditions stayed within a survivable range. Once those conditions shifted too far, continuity became more difficult to maintain. The important point here is that a world in motion places special strain on small populations, because small populations cannot absorb repeated uncertainty as easily as larger ones. A few failed seasons do not need to destroy an entire species to matter. They only need to interrupt enough local lines of survival that the wider human presence becomes narrower than before. Seen from this angle, the Earth before the Toba eruption was already asking a great deal from early humans. It was already a world in which the fit between body and environment could loosen quietly over time. That quiet loosening is important, because it suggests that when later disruption arrived, it did not enter a stable human world. It entered a species already depending on fragile local balances, already living within environmental limits that could shift beyond memory before they could be understood. A changing climate does not affect all living things in the same way, and for early humans this unevenness may have been one of the most important features of the world they inhabited. Humans did not simply face cold or dryness as isolated physical conditions. They faced the way those conditions pass through everything else. Through the distribution of plants, the movement of animals, the reliability of water, and the time available to move between one usable place and another. This is why environmental instability can be difficult to see clearly when looking backward. It is not always visible as destruction. Very often it appears as thinning. A place still exists, but offers less. A season still comes, but not in the same form. A familiar route remains open, but leads to a landscape that no longer supports return in the old way. For a species already living in small and widely spaced populations, these gradual reductions could matter as much as any dramatic event. They narrowed the room within which life could continue. The human body, although adaptable over long spans of evolution, remained dependent on regular success. It needed food that could be found often enough to support adults through movement, pregnancy, care, and recovery. It needed water sources that could be reached without repeated failure. It needed temperatures that could be managed not by technology in the modern sense, but by shelter, fire, clothing, cooperation, and movement. When environmental systems became less predictable, the body did not simply experience inconvenience, it experienced higher cost. More energy had to be spent in searching, more time had to be spent moving, more decisions had to be made under uncertainty. This is one of the quiet ways a changing world places pressure on a species, without ever presenting a single moment that clearly announces itself as disaster. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have mattered deeply because survival was not organized on a continental scale. There was no broad reserve of people, food, or stored security spread evenly across the landscape. There were only local groups with local knowledge, each one depending on whether the world around them still behaved closely enough to what earlier generations had learned. Once that closeness weakened, continuity became harder to maintain. The archaeological record often reflects this uncertainty only indirectly. Human traces appear unevenly across time and space, and this unevenness likely says something important about the conditions under which people could remain in place. Presence was not guaranteed simply because a place had once supported it. A landscape that was livable for one stretch of generations might become more difficult later, even without any clear dividing line between before and after. This helps explain why the world before a possible population crisis must be understood as active and unstable, not as calm background waiting for a shock. Some regions may have acted as temporary refuges, where conditions remained good enough for continuity to hold. Others may have become increasingly difficult, causing human lines there to thin or disappear. This pattern of uneven refuge and uneven loss is especially important when thinking about the origins of our species, because it means that human survival was never a single story unfolding evenly across the Earth. It was always fragmented across many places and many local ecological situations. From that perspective, the idea that humans may have approached a narrow point in their history becomes easier to understand. A species can remain present and still be fragile if most of its continuity depends on a limited number of places continuing to work. Once climate variability is seen in this way, not as weather alone but as a long pressure on habitat, movement, and inherited survival knowledge, the world around 74,000 years ago begins to look less like a stable human stage and more like a shifting field of constraints. In such a world, any additional disruption would not need to invent new weakness. It would only need to press harder on weakness that already existed. Around 74,000 years ago, in what is now northern Sumatra, the volcanic system at Toba produced an eruption so large that it has remained central to discussions of prehistoric environmental change ever since. It is often described as one of the largest known eruptions of the Quaternary period, not simply because of the force released at the vent, but because of how widely its material was dispersed across the surrounding world. Ash from this eruption travelled far beyond the immediate region. Layers associated with it have been identified across South Asia and in marine records far from the source, which helps explain why the event has drawn so much attention in studies of climate and human prehistory. Yet the most important feature of the eruption may not have been the ash that later settled onto land and water, but the material driven high into the atmosphere. Large explosive eruptions can inject sulfur-rich gases into the stratosphere, where they form aerosols that reflect part of the incoming sunlight and temporarily cool the surface below. This basic mechanism is well understood from both modern eruptions and climate science. The question in the case of Toba has never been whether atmospheric effects were possible, but how large those effects were, how long they lasted, and how unevenly they were felt across different regions. Some models and interpretations suggest substantial cooling and drying, especially in the tropics, while other lines of evidence point to a more complex picture, in which severe effects may have been strong in some areas but less visible or shorter-lived in others. This uncertainty matters because it reminds us that a great eruption does not produce a single identical world for everyone beneath it. The sky may dim in one region more than another. Rainfall may weaken in one ecological zone, while a different zone remains more stable. A plant community may struggle while another persists. For human beings living in small groups, that unevenness would have mattered as much as the eruption itself. Early humans did not need the entire planet to become unlivable for danger to increase. They only needed the places they depended on to become less reliable than before. If ash fell over hunting grounds, if seasonal growth patterns weakened, if dry conditions lengthened, or if cooling altered the behavior and location of animals, then the eruption would have entered human life through ordinary necessities rather than through a single dramatic encounter. The body still needed food, water, warmth, and continuity from one season to the next. What made Toba so significant in later thinking is that it may have pressed on all of these requirements at once, directly in some places and indirectly in others. At the same time, caution is necessary. The eruption was real, immense, and environmentally important, but the full scale of its climatic consequences remains debated. Some records from Africa and South Asia do not show the kind of universal collapse that earlier versions of the Toba hypothesis once imagined. Archaeological findings also suggest that human populations in at least some regions continued through this time rather than disappearing completely. That does not make the eruption unimportant. Instead, it changes the way it must be understood. Rather than imagining a single volcanic winter experienced equally by all humans, it may be more accurate to think of Toba as a major disturbance entering an already unstable late Pleistocene world and pushing some local systems closer to their limits. In that sense, the eruption changed the sky, but it also changed the margins within which survival remained possible. For a species already thinly distributed across changing environments, even a temporary reduction in light, rainfall, temperature, or ecological predictability could have consequences that lasted longer than the ash itself. The significance of Toba, then, may lie not in a simple story of near-instant destruction, but in the possibility that an immense volcanic event added new pressure to a human world that was already narrow in numbers, fragmented in space, and dependent on environmental continuity that could never be fully guaranteed. To understand why the Toba eruption matters so much in discussions of human survival, it helps to separate two different kinds of impact that are often blended together too quickly. One is the local and regional effect of the eruption itself: ashfall, darkness near the source, disruption of vegetation, and severe ecological disturbance in areas closer to Sumatra. The other is the broader atmospheric effect that may have followed when sulfur-rich gases rose high into the stratosphere and formed aerosols capable of reflecting sunlight back into space. That second process is the reason Toba is so often connected to the idea of climatic stress on human populations. Very large explosive eruptions are known to cool the surface temporarily through this mechanism, and Toba was indeed an exceptionally large event, often described in the scientific literature as the largest volcanic eruption of the last 2 million years or of the Quaternary period. At the same time, scale alone does not settle the question of consequence. A large eruption can be geologically extraordinary and still affect human populations in uneven ways, depending on where those populations live, how climates respond regionally, and how ecosystems absorb or resist the disruption. This is where the topic becomes more careful and more interesting. Some studies and climate simulations suggest that Toba could have produced marked cooling and drying in certain regions, with the strongest effects in parts of the northern hemisphere and Central Asia, while other areas may have been more sheltered from the worst changes. More recent modelling work has argued that the climatic response was likely pronounced in some places but muted in others, which means there may not have been one single human experience of the eruption across the planet. That unevenness matters because early humans did not survive as a single united population. They survived, if they survived, in local environments that either remained usable or became more difficult than before. The eruption therefore enters the human story not as one universal scene, but as a patchwork of altered skies, weakened seasonal rhythms, and changing ecological limits. Archaeological evidence has added an important caution to older versions of the catastrophe idea. Middle Paleolithic assemblages in India, especially at Jwalapuram, appear on both sides of the youngest Toba tuff ash layer, suggesting continuity of human occupation rather than a simple regional disappearance. Later work in India has continued to examine the immediate environmental effects of the ash-bearing deposits, and recent proxy-based research has found evidence for ecological disturbance after the eruption, while still remaining consistent with the broader picture of occupational continuity in some areas. In East Africa as well, paleo-environmental studies have argued against a simple 6-year volcanic winter and against treating Toba as the sole cause of a sharp genetic bottleneck that brought humanity uniformly to the edge of extinction. These findings do not make the eruption small or irrelevant. They do something more useful. They prevent the story from becoming too simple. Instead of imagining that Toba nearly erased all humans in the same way everywhere, it becomes more reasonable to think that the eruption created a major environmental disturbance whose effects depended on geography, local climate systems, and the pre-existing fragility of small human groups. Around the beginnings of our species, that distinction is essential. Humans did not need a perfectly global catastrophe to come under severe pressure. They only needed enough of their already narrow habitats to become less reliable than before. If some regions became cooler, drier, darker, or ecologically thinner, then groups living there may have struggled more intensely, even while other populations in more favorable settings continued. The eruption, in other words, may have worked less like a single blow and more like an amplifier. It may have added weight to a human world that was already living close to ecological limits, already fragmented across space, and already dependent on local continuity that could be broken quietly over generations. Seen this way, the significance of Toba lies not in a dramatic certainty that all humanity nearly vanished at once, but in the quieter possibility that a very large volcanic event narrowed the number of places where human life could continue with enough stability to carry the species forward. The difficulty in understanding the Toba eruption is that its scale can tempt the mind into a simple image: a single volcanic event, a darkened sky, and a human species pushed almost instantly toward disappearance. But the scientific picture is quieter and more uneven than that. The eruption was enormous, and ash from it spread across a very wide area, leaving a trace that can still be identified far from Sumatra. That alone tells us that the event was not local in any ordinary sense. Yet ash on the ground is only one part of the story. The more far-reaching question is what happened in the atmosphere after the eruption, because large explosive eruptions can send sulfur-rich gases high enough to form reflective particles that reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. In principle, this can cool the climate and alter rainfall patterns for a period of time. In practice, the outcome depends on geography, circulation, season, and the condition of ecosystems that were already under pressure. This is why Toba cannot be understood as a single human experience shared equally across the world. Some regions may have seen stronger cooling or drying. Others may have been buffered. Some landscapes may have lost part of their ecological reliability without becoming completely unusable. For small human groups, that distinction would have mattered greatly. Survival did not require the whole planet to fail. It only required the places a group knew best to become less dependable than before. If familiar plant growth weakened, if water became harder to predict, if animals shifted their movement, or if seasons became less trustworthy, then the eruption would have entered human life through repeated difficulty rather than through one dramatic moment. The body would still need to move, find food, care for children, and continue through the next season. What changes is that each of those tasks begins to cost more. This is one reason the event remains scientifically debated. Some evidence supports serious environmental disruption, while other evidence suggests that the most extreme early versions of a global volcanic winter may have overstated the uniformity of the effects. Archaeological findings in India are especially important here, because some stone tool records appear to continue across the ash horizon rather than ending at it. That does not prove the eruption was mild. It shows instead that continuity may have survived in some places even while conditions worsened in others. Evidence from East Africa has also been used to argue that the eruption did not produce the same severe climatic collapse everywhere. These findings do not weaken the importance of Toba. They make the story more precise. The eruption may not have brought all human groups to the same edge in the same way, but it could still have narrowed the number of environments in which small populations could continue without breaking. That possibility fits the larger pattern already surrounding early humans. They were scattered, limited in number, and dependent on local ecological stability. In such a world, a very large eruption did not need to erase humanity directly. It only needed to intensify uncertainty, reduce reliable habitats, and make continuity harder to maintain across enough regions at once. From that point of view, the sky changed not only above the Earth, but above the fragile line of generations that carried the species forward. And that may be why Toba matters so much. Not because it offers a simple story of near extinction, but because it shows how a species can be placed under pressure by an event that acts unevenly, quietly, and through the ordinary demands of staying alive. What made a period of environmental disruption so dangerous for early humans was not simply that conditions became harsher, but that the human body could not quickly reorganize itself when the world shifted beyond familiar limits. Evolution can shape a species across very long stretches of time, but it does not redesign bodies in the space of a few years, a few generations, or even a few centuries. The body that early Homo sapiens carried into this period had already been formed by earlier climates, earlier ecologies, and earlier patterns of movement. It could tolerate variation, but only within a certain range. When that range was exceeded, the cost of staying alive rose quietly but steadily. A colder environment did not only mean discomfort. It meant more energy spent maintaining body temperature, more pressure to find shelter, more dependence on fire, and less margin when food was already uncertain. A drier environment did not only mean fewer water sources, it meant changes in vegetation, reduced animal presence in some areas, longer movement between usable places, and a greater burden on bodies already using most of their available energy simply to continue. This is the deeper meaning of environmental mismatch. The problem was not that the body suddenly failed. The problem was that the body had been tuned to one set of conditions while the world began to present another. Around the beginning of our species, this mattered especially because human survival depended on repeated success at small scales. People had to walk, carry, gather, track, recover from illness, sustain pregnancies, nurse children, and keep enough social continuity for knowledge to remain useful. None of these activities stops when conditions worsen. They simply become harder. A group can continue through this kind of pressure for a time, but every task begins to require more from the same physical system. That is where danger accumulates. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in the widening gap between what the body can reliably do and what the environment now asks of it. The archaeological and environmental record cannot show this gap directly in the way it can show ash layers or changing vegetation, yet it helps explain why population continuity can weaken even when there is no sign of immediate annihilation. Bodies under greater stress produce fewer reserves. Children are harder to support through difficult seasons. Injury becomes more costly. Recovery takes longer. The loss of one or two capable adults matters more in a small group than it would in a large one. Over time, the line between bodily endurance and demographic survival becomes very thin. This is why the story around 74,000 years ago cannot be told only through eruption size or climate models. It also has to be told through the limits of the human organism itself. Early humans were intelligent, cooperative, and flexible, but those strengths did not remove their biological constraints. They still needed calories at regular intervals. They still needed usable water. They still needed sleep protected from exposure, and social bonds strong enough to distribute labor and care. If an eruption such as Toba altered temperature, rainfall, light, or plant productivity even temporarily across parts of the world, then those changes would have entered the human story through the body long before they appeared as a grand historical pattern. This is one reason the possibility of near extinction remains meaningful, even without certainty about a uniform global catastrophe. A species does not need all of its members to face the same danger at once. It only needs enough local groups to encounter a world that has become more demanding than their bodies can manage over time. Seen in that way, the question is not whether humans were weak in an absolute sense. It is whether the human body, shaped for one range of conditions, was forced to endure another range quickly enough that continuity itself became harder to maintain. In a fragmented species living in scattered groups, even a temporary mismatch between body and world could leave marks that lasted far longer than the environmental disturbance that first produced it. The human body meets environmental change through ordinary needs rather than abstract categories. It does not experience a cooler climate as a line on a chart, or a weaker monsoon as a pattern in a dataset. It experiences those changes through hunger that takes longer to relieve, through longer distances between water and shelter, through children who require the same care in a world that now gives less support than before. This is why mismatch between body and environment can become so serious without ever looking dramatic from a distance. A body shaped by long evolutionary history is always carrying expectations about the world, even if those expectations are not conscious. It expects that effort will be followed by some reward, that movement across land will still lead toward usable resources, that the energy spent searching, carrying, and waiting will not exceed what the environment can return. When those expectations begin to fail repeatedly, the body does not stop functioning at once. It continues, but at a higher cost. Over time, that rising cost can narrow the difference between survival and exhaustion. For early humans, this would have touched nearly every part of life. A colder phase, even if temporary, meant more energy devoted simply to remaining warm enough to function well. A drier phase meant not only thirst, but weaker vegetation, fewer reliable plant foods, and changes in the distribution of animals that were already difficult to predict. Less predictable rain could affect the timing of movement, the value of a familiar camp, and the usefulness of knowledge passed down from older generations. The body had no rapid biological solution to such changes. It could not grow thicker insulation in a few generations. It could not become metabolically different within the span of one environmental disturbance. It remained what it already was, flexible in behavior, but limited in physiology. That distinction matters. Human adaptability is often imagined as something almost limitless, yet the deeper truth is quieter. Humans could improvise, cooperate, share labor, and move across difficult terrain, but all of those strengths still depended on the same biological system continuing to receive enough energy, enough warmth, enough water, and enough recovery to remain viable across seasons. When conditions worsened, cooperation itself became more strained because everyone depended on the same shrinking ecological base. Pregnancy, birth, nursing, and childcare did not pause when landscapes became less generous. Illness did not become less costly when food became scarce. Injury did not become easier to survive when movement had to increase. This is where bodily mismatch becomes demographic pressure. The problem is not only that individuals suffer more, it is that the continuity of a group begins to rely on a smaller and smaller margin. A few weakened adults can mean less food gathered, less knowledge applied successfully, less protection for the vulnerable, and fewer children reaching maturity. In a species already spread thinly across wide regions, these small bodily burdens could accumulate into larger historical consequences. Around the origin and early spread of Homo sapiens, that accumulation may have mattered more than any single moment of visible disaster. If a major eruption altered rainfall, light, temperature, or ecological reliability even for a relatively limited period in some regions, the human body would have met those changes through repeated strain rather than instant collapse. A group might continue through one difficult season and then struggle through another, losing not all at once but slowly through reduced resilience. This helps explain why the danger associated with 74,000 years ago should not be imagined only as ash in the sky or cold across the land. It should also be imagined as the ordinary human body being asked day after day to do more with less. That is often how continuity begins to fail. Not through a single grand ending, but through the quiet widening of the gap between what the body can sustain and what the world now demands. Once that gap becomes too wide across enough places, a species can begin to narrow without ever appearing to vanish in one single scene. What made this biological mismatch especially important was that the human body never responds alone. It exists inside a chain of dependence that reaches outward into family, movement, memory, and time. A single body under stress is one kind of difficulty, Many bodies under the same pressure, across several seasons, within a small group that depends on cooperation, is something much larger. This is where the danger around environmental disruption becomes easier to understand. Early humans were not isolated individuals meeting the landscape one by one. They were members of small communities in which survival depended on shared labor, shared timing, and repeated success across generations. The body was the place where strain was first felt, but the consequences did not remain there. If adults had to spend more energy staying warm, walking farther, or searching longer for water and food, then less energy remained for everything else that allowed a group to continue. Recovery from illness became more difficult. The cost of pregnancy became heavier. Infants, who already depended on prolonged care in our species, became harder to carry through difficult periods. Older knowledge remained valuable, but its value depended on whether the world still resembled the one in which that knowledge had been learned. When the environment shifted too far, memory itself became less dependable as a guide to survival. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have mattered deeply because the human form had not evolved for certainty. It had evolved for persistence within limits. Those limits included temperature, hydration, food availability, and the body's need for rest and repair. If cooling, drying, or ecological instability followed a large volcanic event in even some regions, the human body would not have met that disturbance as a dramatic theory. It would have met it as fatigue that accumulated, as children who were harder to sustain, as familiar territories that returned less than before. This is one reason it is not necessary to imagine a single overwhelming catastrophe affecting all humans equally. Biological pressure works through repetition. A modest worsening of conditions can matter enormously when it continues long enough to reduce reserves that were already small. Small groups do not need to be destroyed to become vulnerable. They only need to lose flexibility. Once energy is spent merely maintaining basic life, the capacity to adapt behaviorally begins to shrink. Movement becomes more costly. Exploration becomes riskier. Care becomes more uneven. In a scattered species, that loss of flexibility can be enough to thin the line of continuity. The human body is often celebrated for its versatility, and that is true in an important sense. It can walk long distances, regulate heat better than many animals during endurance effort, use hands with unusual precision, and survive in a wide range of habitats through cooperation and learned behavior. Yet versatility is not the same as immunity. The body remains bound to slow biological rhythms. It cannot produce a new anatomy in response to a sudden cooling. It cannot shorten the dependency of children because conditions have worsened. It cannot simply decide that less sleep, less food, or less water will no longer matter. This is where a changing world becomes dangerous in a distinctly human way. Human beings carry long childhoods, slow maturation, and heavy dependence on social continuity. Those qualities later supported remarkable cultural endurance, but in hard environments they also made each break in continuity more serious. A few failed years could reach into the next generation, not only by reducing numbers, but by weakening the conditions under which knowledge, care, and bodily resilience were passed forward. Seen in this way, the question is not whether the human body was too weak to survive the world after Toba. The better question is whether the demands placed on that body in some regions became high enough, for long enough, that continuity itself began to narrow. If so, then near extinction would not have looked like a single ending. It would have looked like the body's ordinary burdens becoming slightly too great in too many places at once, until only some human lines remained able to continue. Food, more than any other requirement, reveals how closely early humans were tied to the stability of their environment, and how quickly that stability could begin to weaken without producing a single dramatic sign. For a small human group, food was not something stored in large quantities or secured far in advance. It was something that had to be found again and again across days, across seasons, and across shifting landscapes that did not always behave in predictable ways. This meant that survival depended not only on skill or effort, but on the continued reliability of the ecological systems that supported plant growth and animal movement. When those systems changed, even slightly, the effects could accumulate. A region that once offered a steady supply of edible plants might begin to yield less if rainfall patterns shifted or if temperatures moved outside familiar ranges. Grazing animals that had once passed through a known area might alter their routes or appear less frequently if vegetation declined or water sources became less dependable. These changes did not need to eliminate food entirely. It was enough for them to reduce consistency. The difference between having enough and having just slightly less could become meaningful when repeated over time. The human body, already limited in its ability to store energy over long periods, depended on frequent success in finding nourishment. When that success became less certain, the margin between sustenance and deficit narrowed. This narrowing would have been felt first as a subtle increase in effort. More time spent searching, more distance traveled, more uncertainty in outcomes. Over time, it would also have been felt in the body itself. Fatigue would accumulate more easily. Recovery would become slower. The ability to endure illness or injury would weaken. For groups already living in small numbers, this mattered not only at the level of individual survival, but at the level of continuity across generations. Fewer calories meant less support for pregnancy, less stability for infants, and greater vulnerability during periods when conditions were already difficult. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this connection between environment and nourishment would have been especially direct. There was no separation between the human body and the systems that sustained it. People lived within the same cycles that governed plant growth and animal behavior, and they depended on those cycles remaining within a range that could be learned and anticipated. When an event such as the Toba eruption is considered, its significance lies partly in how it may have altered these cycles, even if only temporarily and unevenly. A reduction in sunlight, a change in rainfall, or a shift in temperature could all affect primary productivity, which in turn shapes the entire food web. Plants grow differently, animals respond to those changes, and humans must respond to both. In some regions, these effects may have been limited or short-lived. In others, they may have persisted long enough to place sustained pressure on already fragile systems. What matters is not whether food disappeared everywhere, but whether it became less reliable in enough places at once. In a scattered population, that reduction in reliability could mean that some groups continued, while others gradually lost the ability to maintain themselves. Archaeological evidence rarely shows hunger directly, but it can reflect patterns consistent with changing resource use, shifting settlement, or interruptions in occupation. These patterns suggest that food was not a constant backdrop to human life, but a variable that could change in ways that were difficult to control. In this sense, the problem was not a single moment of starvation, but a prolonged period in which the environment returned less than it once had, requiring more effort for the same result. This is how food becomes central to the question of near extinction, not because humans suddenly lacked all resources, but because the steady flow of nourishment that supports life became uncertain enough, in enough places, to narrow the path through which continuity could be carried forward. Food uncertainty does not become dangerous only when nothing can be found. It becomes dangerous much earlier, when familiar sources begin to lose their rhythm, and the body can no longer trust the old balance between effort and return. This is an important distinction, because early humans did not need a complete ecological collapse to come under serious pressure. They only needed the world around them to become less dependable than before. A hunting ground could still hold animals, but in smaller numbers or at less predictable times. A place known for plant foods could still produce something, but not enough, or not when expected. Water might still exist, but at greater distance, forcing the body to spend more energy before food could even be searched for. In that kind of world, nourishment becomes a problem of timing as much as quantity. The body can survive temporary shortage, but it does not do so without cost. Once energy intake becomes irregular, strength is no longer available in the same way. Movement becomes heavier. Recovery slows. A small injury matters more. Illness becomes harder to outlast. For pregnant women, nursing mothers, infants, and older adults, the effects can become even more serious, because their needs are less flexible than those of a healthy adult in a good season. Around the early spread of Homo sapiens, this mattered deeply because human survival depended on continuity across generations, not merely on whether a few individuals could endure hardship for a short time. A group might survive one difficult period through persistence, memory, and cooperation, but if food remained uncertain through the next cycle as well, the problem would begin to reach beyond immediate hunger. Children might grow more slowly or fail to survive periods of stress. Adults might conserve energy by moving less, which could reduce exploration and make it harder to find new reliable grounds. Knowledge passed down from earlier generations would remain valuable, but only if the environment still behaved within a recognizable range. Once food patterns shifted too far, memory itself became less effective, because it described a world that was no longer fully there. This is one of the quiet ways environmental change can enter human life. It does not have to destroy everything. It only has to reduce the usefulness of what once kept life going. In the period associated with Toba, this possibility becomes especially important. If ash, cooling, changes in rainfall, or altered plant productivity affected different regions unevenly, then food stress would also have appeared unevenly. Some areas may have remained productive enough for continuity to hold. Others may have become thinner, with fewer dependable returns from the same effort. This unevenness is exactly what makes the question of near extinction plausible without requiring a single universal catastrophe. A species can narrow if enough local groups begin to live with less nutritional security, even while some populations persist elsewhere. Food, in this sense, is not only about calories, it is about stability. It is about whether the body can continue to rely on the world often enough to support not only movement and warmth, but pregnancy, nursing, healing, learning, and the social cooperation that ties one generation to the next. When food becomes irregular, all of those things weaken together. A group can still appear present in the landscape while already becoming more fragile beneath the surface. That is why the question of human survival 74,000 years ago should be imagined not only in terms of volcanic force or climatic change, but in terms of the slower pressure that follows when nourishment becomes uncertain. A species does not need to be struck down all at once to come close to disappearance. It can also be narrowed by repeated seasons in which the body receives just a little less than it needs, until continuity itself begins to thin. What makes food uncertainty so historically important is that it changes the future before it produces a visible ending. A small human group can continue to exist for some time, while already becoming less secure in ways that are difficult to notice from the outside. Adults may still move across the land, still gather, still track, still return to places known from earlier seasons, and yet the relationship between effort and reward may already be shifting against them. This is how ecological pressure often works in deep human history. It does not always arrive as immediate absence. It arrives as thinning. A valley still contains water, but less of it. A familiar route still leads to edible plants, but not in the same quantity or at the same time. Animals are not gone, but they appear less regularly, or at greater distance, or in numbers too small to rely upon with confidence. When this happens repeatedly, the body is forced into a quieter form of strain. More energy is spent searching. More time is spent moving. More uncertainty surrounds each decision. The cost is not only physical, it is temporal. A day used to find too little food is also a day not used for recovery, for social repair, for careful observation, or for the slower work of passing knowledge forward. Around the early history of our species, this mattered because human groups were small and their resilience was limited by number as much as by strength. A larger population can sometimes absorb repeated shortage without immediately losing continuity, because it has more adults, more overlapping skill, and more room for recovery after difficulty. A small population has less reserve. If food becomes uncertain for long enough, the damage does not remain at the level of hunger. It reaches into fertility, infant survival, cooperation, and mobility. Children require prolonged nourishment in our species, and that dependence is one of the deepest biological features of being human. When food returns less than before, adults may still survive for a time, but children become harder to support through stress, and the next generation becomes less secure before the present one has visibly disappeared. This helps explain why a species can approach a narrow point in its history without leaving behind one obvious scene of collapse. The narrowing may happen through repeated reductions in demographic success rather than through one final blow. In the period associated with the Toba eruption, that possibility becomes especially important because environmental disruption would not have needed to erase every food system equally. It would only have needed to reduce reliability across enough local habitats that scattered groups began to lose continuity in different places, sometimes gradually, sometimes without leaving a strong trace. Some populations may have continued in ecological refuges where water, vegetation, and animal movement remained good enough to sustain life. Others may have entered harsher cycles in which every season demanded more than the body could comfortably repay. Over time, this unevenness would have shaped which human lines remained present and which ones thinned out across generations. From the perspective of deep time, food is therefore not merely one need among others. It is the medium through which the environment either continues to support human life or quietly withdraws that support. When nourishment becomes unstable, warmth becomes harder to maintain, movement becomes more expensive, healing becomes less certain, and social cooperation itself can weaken because every member of the group depends on the same shrinking base. This is why the question of near extinction cannot be understood only through volcanic size or climatic debate. It must also be understood through the ordinary, repeated bodily fact that a species survives only when enough food continues to move through enough human lives, in enough places, for time itself to remain connected. If that flow narrows too far, even without universal famine, the species can come much closer to disappearance than the landscape alone might suggest. Movement was never simply a choice for early humans. It was a condition of survival, shaped by the need to follow water, food, and seasonal change across landscapes that did not remain still. Yet movement also carried a quiet risk that becomes clearer when environments grow less predictable. A group could not remain in one place indefinitely if the surrounding resources weakened, but moving away from familiar ground meant leaving behind the knowledge that made survival possible in the first place. This tension between staying and moving may have become more pronounced in periods when ecological patterns began to shift, because neither option remained fully secure. Staying in a place that was becoming less productive could gradually reduce a group's ability to sustain itself. Moving into a new area introduced uncertainty about what would be found there and whether the same strategies would work under different conditions. Around the early history of our species, this problem would have been especially difficult because human populations were small, widely distributed, and dependent on detailed local knowledge of terrain, water, plant cycles, and animal behavior. That knowledge was not abstract. It was built slowly, through repeated observation and shared memory across generations. It guided where to walk, when to move, where to rest, and where to expect return. When environmental change disrupted those patterns, movement became less guided by certainty and more by necessity. A route that once connected reliable places might no longer lead to the same outcome. A new path might offer temporary relief but no long-term stability. In such conditions, the cost of movement could rise without a corresponding increase in reward. This is one of the ways environmental disruption can quietly narrow the space in which life can continue. Movement is often seen as a sign of adaptability, and in many ways it is. Humans can travel long distances, adjust behavior, and cooperate in ways that allow them to explore unfamiliar ground. But adaptability is not unlimited. The body still requires energy, rest, and protection, and each of these becomes harder to secure when the environment offers less predictable support. Moving farther means spending more energy before food is even found. It means carrying children across greater distances. It means facing unfamiliar climates and unfamiliar risks without the benefit of accumulated experience. In a stable world, these costs can be managed because movement leads from one reliable place to another. In an unstable world, movement can become a cycle of searching without clear return. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human presence across landscapes was often intermittent, appearing in some places for a time and then fading, possibly reflecting shifts in environmental conditions or resource availability. These patterns are not always easy to interpret, but they are consistent with the idea that movement was both necessary and uncertain. Groups may have followed changing resources, but not every movement would have led to a new stable position. Some may have succeeded in finding areas where conditions remained favorable. Others may have entered regions where survival became more difficult, reducing continuity over time. Around 74,000 years ago, if environmental systems were altered by volcanic and climatic processes in some regions, this tension between movement and uncertainty would likely have intensified. Groups already living near the limits of what their surroundings could support may have been forced to move more frequently or over longer distances, increasing the cost of survival while reducing the reliability of outcomes. In such a context, movement does not guarantee safety. It becomes another form of exposure, another way in which the human body and its social structure are tested against a world that no longer behaves as expected. When thinking about the possibility of near extinction, this matters because a species does not need to be destroyed in place. It can also be weakened through repeated movements that fail to establish new continuity. Each unsuccessful relocation, each movement that leads to thinner resources or greater uncertainty, can reduce the number of people able to carry life forward into the next generation. Over time, this can narrow the presence of a species without any single moment marking its decline. In this way, movement, which once allowed humans to persist across changing environments, may also have become one of the pathways through which vulnerability increased when those environments shifted too far beyond what could be known and managed. Distance can make a species more fragile even when it appears to spread across a wide landscape. For early humans, this was one of the quiet structural risks built into their existence. Groups were not densely connected parts of a single living network. They were often separated by long stretches of land, by unfamiliar ecological zones, and by changing conditions that made contact uncertain. This meant that each group depended heavily on its own continuity. If a local population weakened, there was no guarantee that another group would arrive soon enough or close enough to reinforce it. The distance between groups, therefore, mattered not only as geography, but as a limit on recovery. In a stable environment, wide spacing may still allow a species to persist if each local group can maintain itself over time. But once conditions become less reliable, separation begins to carry a different meaning. It turns local hardship into demographic risk. A few difficult seasons in one place may remain contained if neighboring groups are near, numerous, and able to reconnect. If those neighbors are far away, small in number, or facing similar strain of their own, then a weakened group may simply fade from the landscape without replacement. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have been especially important because humans were already living through a pattern of scattered presence rather than continuous occupation everywhere. Their survival was being carried by many separate lines, each one exposed to local conditions and each one vulnerable to interruption. Distance made those lines thinner than they might seem when viewed from the scale of a continent. It also changed the meaning of movement. Movement was not only a search for food or better ground. It was sometimes the only way to maintain contact with a wider human presence. Yet the farther groups had to travel, the more energy movement required, and the greater the uncertainty about what lay beyond familiar routes. In a world where water, vegetation, and animal movement were becoming less predictable, even the possibility of reconnecting with other humans may have become less dependable. This matters because human continuity depends on more than simple survival from one day to the next. It depends on adults finding partners, on children being raised within stable cooperative groups, on knowledge being refreshed through repeated contact with landscapes and with other people. When distance grows alongside ecological stress, these forms of continuity begin to weaken together. A group can remain alive and still become demographically narrower if fewer bonds are formed, fewer children survive, and fewer opportunities exist to reconnect with nearby human lines. This may be one of the least visible but most important ways a species approaches a bottleneck, not through a single scene of destruction, but through spacing that becomes too wide for easy recovery. Around 74,000 years ago, if environmental disruption reduced the number of reliably habitable places in some regions, then distance between surviving groups may have become even more significant. A habitat patch that once connected one group to another might no longer support regular movement. A corridor once crossed in a favorable season might become too dry, too cold, or too uncertain to trust. In that case, human presence would not only become smaller in number, it would become more isolated in structure. Some groups may have persisted in ecological refuges, but persistence in isolation carries its own limits. A species survives through time not merely because some people remain somewhere, but because enough continuity remains across enough places for life to keep renewing itself. Distance can quietly interfere with that renewal. It turns the loss of one group into the loss of an entire local line, not easily replaced by others. In this sense, space itself becomes part of the danger. The farther apart early humans were, the less resilient the species became when the world around them grew more unstable. If Toba-era disruption narrowed the number of usable landscapes, then the surviving human world may have become not only smaller, but more scattered, and therefore less able to recover from each additional loss. What makes small and distant populations so vulnerable is that loss does not remain local for very long. In a widely scattered species, every group carries more than its own immediate survival. It also carries part of the larger continuity of the species, even if no one within that group could possibly know this. A small human community may appear stable for a time if it can still find food, maintain social bonds, and raise children into adulthood. But if the nearest neighboring group is far away, separated by difficult terrain or by environments that have become less predictable, then that apparent stability rests on a very narrow foundation. It means that recovery from hardship has little outside support. A few deaths, a few failed births, a few seasons of poorer nourishment, or a few movements that do not lead to better ground may be enough to weaken the whole line beyond easy repair. This is why distance matters not only as geography but as time. The farther apart groups are, the longer it takes for contact, assistance, exchange, or replacement to become possible. And in harsh conditions, that delay can matter more than strength itself. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have created a world in which human presence was real but uneven, durable in some places and very thin in others. The species was not protected by its total number in any simple sense, because what mattered was not only how many humans existed, but how they were distributed across space. If they were too dispersed, then survival became a chain made of many separate links, and each link could fail on its own. Environmental disruption would have sharpened this problem. If climatic stress, ecological change, or volcanic aftereffects reduced the number of landscapes that could reliably support human life, then the remaining groups may have been pushed into a more fragmented arrangement than before. Some would have stayed in local refuges where water, food, and movement remained possible. Others would have been forced to move, perhaps entering unfamiliar areas where the chance of establishing lasting continuity was lower. In both cases, the broader human world could have become more patchy, more broken into separate islands of survival. This matters because human continuity depends on renewal. It depends on enough adults living long enough to support children, enough children reaching maturity, enough exchange of knowledge, and enough contact across generations that local decline does not become permanent disappearance. Once groups become too isolated, even modest pressure can do more lasting damage. A group may endure one poor season and then another, but with no nearby line to reconnect with, no easy path to merge, and no surplus of people to absorb repeated loss. Endurance itself begins to narrow. Over time, the species may remain present while becoming demographically thinner and structurally weaker. This is one of the quietest ways near extinction can take shape. It does not require a single continent-wide collapse. It only requires enough separation, enough uncertainty, and enough small local failures that continuity begins to break in more places than it can be restored. The archaeological record cannot always show these breaks clearly, because absence leaves less evidence than presence. But the logic of population structure helps explain why the early human world may have been more fragile than it appears. A species spread across distance can look broad on a map while remaining narrow in its actual ability to survive disruption. This is especially important when thinking about 74,000 years ago, because if humans were already scattered and dependent on local ecological success, then any additional stress would have done more than reduce numbers. It could have increased isolation itself, turning distance into a force that quietly separated surviving groups from one another until only some lines remained able to continue through time. In that sense, the danger was not only that humans were few, it was that they may also have been too far apart to lose much, and still remain securely connected as a species. When scientists speak about a possible narrowing of human populations around 74,000 years ago, they often use the term bottleneck. But this word can be misunderstood if it is imagined as a single dramatic moment in which nearly all humans disappeared at once. In its most careful sense, a bottleneck refers to a reduction in population size that leaves a lasting effect on genetic diversity, not necessarily because of one sudden event, but because fewer individuals contribute to future generations over a period of time. This distinction matters because it allows the idea to remain consistent with a world in which some human groups continued while others thinned or disappeared. Genetic studies of modern human populations have sometimes been interpreted as suggesting that our species may have passed through such a narrowing at some point in the past, with fewer ancestral lines contributing to the genetic variation seen today. However, the timing, scale, and causes of any such bottleneck remain debated. Some earlier interpretations connected it directly and strongly to the Toba eruption, proposing that environmental disruption may have reduced human populations to very low numbers. More recent work has been more cautious, pointing out that genetic patterns can be shaped by many processes, including population structure, migration, and long-term demographic changes that do not require a single catastrophic cause. This means that the idea of a bottleneck is not a fixed conclusion, but a way of thinking about how continuity might narrow without becoming entirely broken. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this kind of narrowing would have been possible even in the absence of a single overwhelming disaster, simply because populations were small, scattered, and dependent on local ecological stability. If some groups failed to continue while others persisted, the overall human population could become both smaller and less diverse over time. In that sense, a bottleneck does not need to be imagined as a sudden collapse across the entire species. It can also be understood as a gradual filtering process, in which fewer and fewer lines carry forward into the future. The Toba eruption remains relevant to this discussion because it represents a large environmental disturbance that may have interacted with these underlying conditions. If ecological stress increased in some regions, it could have contributed to local population reductions that, when combined across space and time, resulted in a narrower set of surviving human lineages. At the same time, archaeological evidence showing continuity in certain areas, such as parts of India, suggests that not all human populations were equally affected, and that survival may have been more resilient in some regions than in others. This unevenness is important because it fits with the idea that a bottleneck, if it occurred, would not have been a single uniform event, but a pattern emerging from many local outcomes. Some groups may have remained relatively stable, others may have declined, and still others may have disappeared entirely. The genetic legacy of such a process would not record each local story directly, but it could reflect the combined result: fewer ancestral lines contributing to later populations. From this perspective, the question is not whether a bottleneck happened in a precise singular way, but how close human populations may have come to such a narrowing, and how environmental change, population structure, and biological limits could have interacted to produce it. Thinking in this way keeps the focus on continuity rather than collapse. It suggests that the survival of our species may have depended not on avoiding all loss, but on whether enough lines remained unbroken for the future to continue. If a narrowing of human populations did occur around this time, it would not have appeared as a clear boundary in the landscape, or as a moment that could be directly observed. Instead, it would have taken shape across generations, through differences in which groups continued and which ones did not. Genetic studies provide one way of approaching this question, because they allow scientists to look backward through patterns of variation in modern human populations and infer how many ancestral lines contributed to what exists today. Some analyses have suggested that human genetic diversity reflects a period in which the effective population size, meaning the number of individuals contributing to future generations, may have been relatively small. However, interpreting this signal is not straightforward. Effective population size is not the same as the total number of people alive at a given time, and it can be influenced by many factors, including how populations are structured, how they move, and how often they exchange genes with one another. A species that is widely dispersed but divided into small, partially isolated groups can show genetic patterns that resemble a bottleneck, even if no single catastrophic event reduced all populations at once. This is why the idea of a Toba-driven near-extinction remains debated. Some earlier models suggested that the eruption could have sharply reduced human numbers, but more recent research has emphasized that the genetic evidence does not require a single, global collapse. Instead, it can be explained by a combination of long-term demographic processes, including periods of low population density, regional isolation, and uneven survival across different habitats. This more cautious view aligns with archaeological findings that show continuity in some areas during and after the time of the eruption. For example, stone tool traditions in parts of India appear to persist across the ash layer associated with Toba, suggesting that at least some human groups remained present despite environmental disturbance. At the same time, the absence or thinning of evidence in other regions may indicate that not all populations experienced the same conditions or outcomes. This uneven pattern is important because it fits with how a bottleneck might emerge without a single defining moment. If some groups survived in relatively stable environments while others declined or disappeared in more affected regions, the overall human population could become narrower in its genetic base, even though it never vanished completely. Over many generations, the descendants of surviving groups would carry forward only a portion of the earlier diversity, while lost lineages would leave no direct trace except through their absence. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this process would have been shaped by the same factors already described: small population size, wide geographic spacing, dependence on local ecological stability, and limited capacity for rapid biological adaptation. When environmental conditions became less predictable, whether due to volcanic activity, climatic fluctuation, or other causes, these underlying conditions could amplify the effect of local losses. A group that failed to maintain continuity would not simply reduce the number of people in that region, it would remove an entire branch of the human lineage from the future. If this happened repeatedly, in different places and at different times, the cumulative effect could resemble a bottleneck when viewed through genetic evidence, even if no single event can be identified as its sole cause. This perspective shifts the question away from searching for one moment of near extinction and toward understanding how multiple pressures could have combined to narrow human continuity. It suggests that the survival of our species was not secured by avoiding all loss, but by maintaining enough connected lines of descent across time for life to continue despite repeated challenges. In that sense, the genetic record does not provide a simple answer, but it does offer a way of seeing how close human populations may have come to a point where continuity depended on fewer and fewer surviving groups. If the idea of a bottleneck is taken seriously, then it also changes how survival itself must be understood. It suggests that what continued into the future was not the full range of human variation that once existed, but only a portion of it. This does not mean that something essential to being human was lost in a simple or visible way. Instead, it means that many possible lines of development, many local adaptations, and many small variations that had once been part of the species may not have continued. In a world of small, scattered populations, each group would have carried its own combination of traits shaped by local conditions. Some of these combinations may have been well suited to particular environments. Others may have been more flexible across changing conditions. When environmental pressures increased, whether gradually or in connection with events like the Toba eruption, not all of these combinations would have been equally able to continue. Some lines may have persisted because they happened to occupy regions that remained relatively stable. Others may have survived because their behavioral flexibility allowed them to adjust to changing patterns of food and movement. Still, others may have continued simply because conditions in their environment did not shift as far or as quickly as in other places. At the same time, many lines may have ended, not because they lacked intelligence or cooperation, but because the combination of environment, population size, and chance placed them outside the range in which continuity could be maintained. Over many generations, this process would not have produced a clear boundary between survival and disappearance. It would have produced a narrowing, in which fewer and fewer lines carried forward into the future. The genetic patterns observed in modern humans can be consistent with such a narrowing, even if they do not point to a single moment of near extinction. What they reflect is the outcome of many local histories combined, some continuing, others ending without direct trace. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this way of thinking is important because it removes the need to imagine survival as a single event that either happened or did not happen. Instead, it can be understood as an ongoing process in which continuity was maintained under conditions that were often uncertain and sometimes unfavorable. The Toba eruption, in this context, becomes one part of a larger picture. It may have added pressure to an already fragile system, contributing to the loss of some human lines while leaving others intact. It may have shifted ecological conditions in ways that favored certain regions or strategies over others, but it does not need to be the sole cause of a bottleneck for it to matter. Its significance lies in how it may have interacted with population structure, environmental variability, and biological limits to shape which human lines remained connected to the future. This perspective also helps explain why the concept of near extinction remains both meaningful and difficult to define precisely. A species can approach a narrow point in its history without ever reaching a moment where only a handful of individuals remain. It can instead pass through a period in which many possible futures are reduced to fewer actual outcomes. In that sense, near extinction is not only about numbers, it is about how much of the species' potential variation continues. If enough lines are lost, the species that emerges afterward is still human, but it is a narrower version of what once existed. This is a quiet but important way of understanding survival. It suggests that what continues into the present is not the full history of human possibility, but the result of a long process in which continuity was maintained under pressure, and in which many paths were closed simply because they could not be carried forward through the conditions that existed at that time. When a species passes through a period of narrowing, what disappears is not always visible, and what remains is not always recognized as partial. For early humans, this would have meant that the continuation of life did not carry forward every variation, every adaptation, or every local way of living that once existed. Instead, it carried forward only those lines that remained connected across generations. This is an important shift in perspective, because it moves the question away from how many humans survived and toward what kind of human continuity remained. In a world of scattered groups, each living within specific environments, variation would have been a natural part of existence. Some groups may have adapted more closely to coastal resources, others to inland plains, others to woodland or mixed environments where different strategies were needed to secure food and water. These differences were not separate species, but they represented distinct ways in which the human body and behavior could align with local conditions. When environmental pressures increased, whether gradually or in connection with events like Toba, not all of these alignments would have remained viable. Some environments may have become less productive. Others may have shifted too quickly for learned knowledge to remain useful. In those places, continuity may have weakened until it could no longer be maintained. The loss of a group in such conditions does not leave a detailed record of its particular way of life. It leaves an absence. Over time, these absences accumulate into a reduction of variation. What survives is not a full representation of what once existed, but a subset shaped by which lines were able to continue. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this reduction may have mattered in ways that are difficult to see directly but important to consider. If certain environments became less stable or less predictable, then the groups adapted to those environments may have been more vulnerable. Their knowledge, finely tuned to local conditions, may have lost effectiveness as those conditions changed. Other groups, perhaps living in regions where change was less severe, or where ecological diversity provided more options, may have had a better chance of maintaining continuity. Over generations, this uneven survival would shape the overall character of the species. The human populations that continued would carry forward the traits and behaviors that were compatible with the conditions that remained. Those that did not continue would leave no direct descendants, and therefore no lasting influence on the future of the species. This does not imply a simple selection of the strongest or the most advanced. It reflects a combination of factors, including environment, chance, population size, and the timing of change. In this sense, the narrowing associated with a bottleneck can be understood as a filtering process. The world does not choose deliberately, but the conditions present at a given time determine which lines are able to persist. For early humans, whose existence depended on a close relationship with local environments, this filtering would have been closely tied to ecological change. If a major disturbance altered that relationship across enough regions, then the range of human variation that could be sustained would also become narrower. The significance of this lies in how it shapes the human story that continues into the present. Modern humans share a relatively low level of genetic diversity compared to many other species, and while this has multiple causes, it is consistent with a history in which population sizes were once smaller and less varied than they might have been. This does not point to a single moment when everything was reduced at once, but to a longer process in which continuity depended on fewer and fewer lines. Thinking about 74,000 years ago in this way does not require certainty about a precise number of survivors. It requires only the recognition that the human past may have included periods when many possible forms of human life were no longer carried forward, and that what remains today is the result of those earlier constraints. What this kind of narrowing means in practice is that survival is not only about enduring a difficult period, but about which ways of living remain possible afterward. And Turking, for early humans, ways of living were closely tied to particular environments and to the knowledge built within them. A group living near a river system might develop a deep familiarity with seasonal water levels, with the plants that grew along its banks, and with the animals that depended on it. Another group living in a more open landscape might depend on different patterns, tracking herds across wider distances and relying on knowledge of movement and timing rather than fixed locations. These differences were not superficial. They were ways of organizing life that matched the structure of the environment. When environmental conditions changed, some of these ways of living may have remained viable, while others became more difficult to sustain. This is where the narrowing of human continuity becomes more than a question of numbers. It becomes a question of which ecological relationships continued into the future. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have mattered because human populations were still closely bound to the specific conditions of their surroundings. They did not have the technological capacity to reshape entire landscapes or to buffer themselves completely from environmental change. Their survival depended on maintaining a workable relationship with what was already there. If that relationship weakened in certain regions, the knowledge and practices tied to those regions could also weaken. Over time, if groups associated with particular ecological strategies did not continue, those strategies themselves would not be carried forward. This does not mean that knowledge disappeared suddenly or completely. It means that the range of possible ways of living may have become narrower. The human species that continued would still be capable of adapting to different environments, but it would do so starting from a smaller set of inherited variations. This helps explain why the idea of near extinction is not only about how many people remained, but about how much of human diversity remained. A species can survive numerically while losing a portion of its earlier variation. In such a case, the future is shaped by what is left, not by what was once possible. In the period associated with the Toba eruption, if environmental disruption affected some habitats more than others, then the narrowing of human continuity may have been uneven in a similar way. Groups in more stable or diverse environments may have had a greater chance of maintaining their ways of living, while those in more affected areas may have faced increasing difficulty. Over generations, this would influence not only which populations survived, but also which patterns of behavior, movement, and resource use were carried forward. Archaeological evidence can sometimes hint at such changes through shifts in tool use, settlement patterns, or resource exploitation, though it rarely captures the full complexity of what was lost. Still, these traces support the idea that human life has always been shaped by changing relationships with the environment. When conditions change, the space of possible human actions also changes. Some options remain open, others close, and the path that continues is defined by the intersection of what the environment allows and what the human body and social structure can support. From this perspective, the narrowing associated with a bottleneck can be seen as a reduction in the range of viable human-environment relationships. The species that emerges afterward is not entirely new, but it is shaped by a more limited set of conditions than before. Around 74,000 years ago, if such a process was underway, then the human future that followed would have been built upon those surviving relationships. This does not make that future inevitable or predetermined. It simply reflects the outcome of a period in which continuity was maintained under constraint, and in which the variety of ways humans could exist in the world may have become smaller than it once had been. What follows from this narrowing is not an immediate transformation that can be clearly seen, but a subtle shift in what the species is able to do over time. When variation is reduced, the range of responses available to future generations becomes more limited, even if that limitation is not obvious at first. Early humans did not carry a single fixed way of living. They carried a range of possibilities shaped by different environments, different patterns of movement, and different forms of knowledge built through experience. When some of those lines did not continue, the possibilities they represented also did not continue. The species that moved forward into later periods did so with a narrower base of inherited variation. This does not imply weakness in a simple sense. It implies a different kind of constraint, one that becomes visible only when conditions change again. A broader range of variation can offer more ways to respond to new challenges, while a narrow range requires adaptation to occur within tighter limits. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, This distinction would have mattered because environmental conditions did not become permanently stable after any single event. The world continued to shift, sometimes gradually and sometimes in ways that required new adjustments. If human variation had already been reduced, then each new change would have been met by a species carrying fewer inherited options. This does not prevent survival, but it shapes the path through which survival must occur. The body, the mind, and the social structure must work with what remains, not with what once existed. In this way, the effects of a possible bottleneck extend beyond the period in which it occurs. They influence how the species responds to later challenges, how it spreads into new environments, and how it maintains continuity across time. The archaeological record offers indirect support for this kind of process. Over long periods, patterns of human activity show both continuity and change, suggesting that while certain strategies persisted, others may have been replaced or not carried forward. These shifts are not always easy to interpret, but they are consistent with a species that adapts within constraints rather than from a limitless set of possibilities. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations did pass through a period of narrowing, then the continuation of the species afterward would have depended on how those remaining lines were able to function within the environments they occupied. Some regions may have provided stable conditions that allowed continuity to strengthen again over time. Others may have remained difficult, requiring ongoing adjustment. The important point is that survival did not reset the species to a neutral state. It carried forward a particular configuration of traits, behaviors, and relationships that had already been shaped by earlier pressures. From that point on, every new generation would build upon that configuration. This perspective helps explain why the idea of near extinction is not only about a moment of danger in the past, but about how that moment may have shaped everything that followed. A species that survives after a narrowing does not simply return to what it was before. It continues from where it remained, carrying both the resilience that allowed it to persist and the limitations that resulted from what was lost. When thinking about the human story in this way, the period around 74,000 years ago becomes part of a longer process in which continuity was maintained under constraint, and in which the range of possible human futures may have been quietly reduced before expanding again in later periods. Even if the human species did not experience a single, uniform collapse, the question of why some groups continued while others did not becomes central to understanding how continuity was maintained. Survival in this context was not a simple outcome of strength or intelligence. It was shaped by a combination of factors that often lay outside the control of any one group. Geography was one of these factors. Some regions may have remained more stable during periods of environmental disruption, offering water, vegetation, and animal life in patterns that were still usable, even if reduced. These areas could function as temporary refuges, where the relationship between the human body and the environment remained within a survivable range. Other regions may have experienced greater changes, making it harder for small populations to maintain continuity over time. This unevenness would have meant that survival was not distributed equally across the species. Some groups, by chance of location, may have faced fewer disruptions, while others encountered conditions that became increasingly difficult to manage. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this mattered because populations were already small and dispersed. There was no central population from which recovery could easily spread. Instead, survival depended on whether enough local groups remained in places where continuity was still possible. This is where environmental variation becomes a key part of the explanation. A landscape with diverse ecological zones may have offered more options, allowing groups to adjust movement patterns and resource use as conditions changed. A more uniform landscape, by contrast, might have provided fewer alternatives if the primary resources became less reliable. In this way, the structure of the environment itself could influence which human lines were able to continue. Another factor was the timing of change. Not all regions would have experienced environmental stress at the same moment or with the same intensity. Some groups may have encountered disruption earlier and had more time to adjust, while others may have faced more abrupt changes. This difference in timing could affect whether adaptation was possible. A gradual shift might allow a group to modify behavior, explore new areas, or develop new patterns of resource use. A more rapid change might leave less opportunity for adjustment, increasing the risk of discontinuity. These differences do not point to a single cause of survival, but to a pattern in which multiple conditions interacted. Biological limits, ecological variation, population structure, and chance all played a role. For early humans, whose existence depended on maintaining a balance between body and environment, even small advantages could matter over time. A group that happened to occupy a slightly more stable region, or that encountered change in a way that allowed gradual adjustment, might have been able to maintain continuity across generations. Another group, facing slightly harsher conditions or less favorable timing, might not have been able to do so. From the perspective of deep time, these differences accumulate. The lines that continue become the ancestors of later populations, while those that do not continue leave no direct trace. The result is not a clear division between success and failure, but a gradual shaping of the species through uneven survival. Around 74,000 years ago, this process may have been especially significant if environmental disruption increased the differences between regions, making some places more supportive of human life and others less so. In that case, the survival of our species would not have depended on a single group or a single location, but on a network of surviving populations, each maintaining continuity under different local conditions. The question of why humans survived, then, becomes a question about how enough of these local continuities remained connected to time, even as others were lost. It is not a story of uniform resilience, but of uneven persistence across a world that did not change in the same way everywhere. Another reason some human groups may have continued while others did not lies in the social structure of our species. Humans do not survive only as bodies moving through landscapes. They survive through cooperation, through shared memory, and through the ability to distribute risk across more than one individual. This would have mattered greatly around the early history of Homo sapiens, because environmental stress does not affect every member of a group in the same way at the same time. One person may still be strong enough to travel, another may still remember the location of a distant water source, another may still be able to care for children while others search for food. In this sense, survival depends not only on what the environment offers, but on whether a group can continue functioning as a coordinated unit while conditions become harder. Small groups were fragile in number, but cooperation may also have been one of the main reasons they could persist at all. Shared labor reduces the cost carried by any one body. Shared knowledge allows a group to respond with more than one possible strategy when familiar patterns weaken. Fire, shelter, movement, food gathering, and childcare all become more reliable when they are not carried by isolated individuals. Around the beginning of our species, this social capacity may have been especially important because the human life cycle is unusually demanding. Human children remain dependent for a long time. Pregnancy and nursing require sustained support. Illness and injury can interrupt the contribution of key adults. In such a species, continuity depends heavily on whether the group remains socially intact under pressure. If environmental disruption followed the Toba eruption in some regions, then the groups most likely to continue may not have been those that were simply strongest in a physical sense, but those whose cooperation remained effective under worsening conditions. This does not mean early humans consciously understood themselves as preserving the species. It means that ordinary acts of social continuity may have had species-level consequences over time. A group that shared food more effectively, remembered routes more accurately, protected children more consistently, or adjusted movement without breaking apart may have been more likely to carry life through difficult periods. At the same time, social structure is not an unlimited protection. It also depends on ecological stability. Cooperation works best when there is still enough to distribute, enough time to recover, and enough predictability for memory to remain useful. Once food becomes too uncertain, once movement becomes too costly, or once repeated stress weakens too many bodies at once, even strong cooperation can begin to fray. This is why survival cannot be attributed to one factor alone. The same social dependence that gives humans resilience also creates vulnerability. Because if a small group loses too many adults, or if repeated environmental strain undermines the support needed for children and the injured, then continuity may break more quickly than in a species with a shorter childhood and lower dependence on social care. Around 74,000 years ago, the groups that remained may therefore have done so partly because enough of their social structure stayed functional under pressure. Their environments may have remained just stable enough, their movements just successful enough, and their internal cooperation just strong enough for one generation to support the next. This way of thinking keeps the story grounded. Humans may have survived not because they were destined to, and not because they possessed one special trait that guaranteed success, but because in some places the bond between environment, body, and social life remained unbroken long enough for continuity to continue. The difference between disappearance and persistence may have depended on whether small groups could keep acting together while the world around them grew less reliable. In that sense, survival was not only ecological or biological, it was also relational. It depended on whether human beings, fragile on their own, could remain human together under conditions that narrowed the margin for every form of life they carried forward. Beyond geography and cooperation, another element that may have shaped which human groups continued is the role of timing and chance. This is often the least visible part of the story, yet it may be one of the most influential. Environmental change does not unfold in a perfectly even or predictable way, and human lives do not align neatly with those changes. A group might encounter a difficult period when its numbers are relatively strong, when several capable adults are present, and when knowledge of nearby landscapes is still reliable. Another group, facing similar environmental pressure, might do so at a moment when its numbers are already reduced, when key individuals are lost, or when its knowledge is less applicable to changing conditions. In such cases, the outcome can differ not because one group is fundamentally more capable, but because the timing of stress intersects differently with the structure of the group. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have been especially important because small populations are more sensitive to such variations. A single successful season can stabilize a group long enough for recovery. A single failed movement or an unexpected shortage at the wrong moment can weaken a group that has little reserve. This is where chance enters the picture, not as randomness without pattern, but as the intersection between environmental change and the specific situation of each group. A water source might remain usable in one year and fail in the next. A migration path might still hold animals in one season and not in another. A region might experience a slightly milder shift in climate compared to another nearby area. These differences, while small in isolation, can have lasting consequences when they affect the ability of a group to maintain continuity. If the period associated with the Toba eruption introduced additional environmental stress, then the outcome for human populations may have depended in part on how those stresses aligned with local conditions at particular moments. Some groups may have encountered disruption in a way that allowed gradual adjustment. Others may have faced more abrupt or poorly timed changes that reduced their ability to respond. Over time, these differences would accumulate. The groups that happened to pass through difficult periods with enough stability to maintain continuity would carry forward into the future. Those that did not would leave no direct descendants. This does not imply that survival was arbitrary, but it does suggest that it was not entirely determined by any single factor. Biological limits, ecological conditions, social structure, and timing all interacted in ways that could not be controlled or predicted by the individuals involved. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations approached a narrower point in their history, then chance may have played a role in determining which lines remained. Not chance in the sense of pure unpredictability, but in the sense that small differences in circumstance could lead to different outcomes when the margin for survival was already thin. A group that encountered slightly more favorable conditions, or that experienced stress at a moment when it was better able to absorb it, might continue. Another, facing similar challenges at a less favorable time, might not. Over many generations, this uneven pattern would shape the human population that remained. The species that continued into later periods would therefore be the result of both underlying resilience and the particular ways in which environmental and demographic conditions aligned. This perspective helps explain why the question of survival cannot be reduced to a single cause. It was not only the eruption, not only the climate, not only the body, and not only social structure. It was the combination of all of these, interacting across time and space, with outcomes that were not identical for every group. In that sense, the survival of humans through this period may be understood as the continuation of enough lines under conditions that did not completely coincide in their severity everywhere at once. The species did not need to avoid all difficulty. It needed enough continuity, in enough places, for time to remain connected. After a period of narrowing, the continuation of a species depends not only on survival in the immediate sense, but on how life resumes its patterns across generations. What remains must begin to rebuild continuity, not in a dramatic or rapid way, but through the gradual re-establishment of stable relationships between body, environment, and social structure. For early humans, this would have meant that groups which persisted through a period of environmental stress would begin to move again within landscapes that were still changing, still uncertain, but perhaps becoming more workable than before. This does not imply a clear moment of recovery. It suggests a slow shift in which conditions, in some regions, began to support repeated success once more. The human body, unchanged in its basic form, would still require food, water, warmth, and cooperation, but the cost of obtaining these may have become slightly more manageable in places where environmental pressure eased. This easing, even if partial or uneven, would allow small groups to maintain continuity with less strain. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this stage is important because it determines not only that survival continued, but how it continued. A species that has passed through a narrowing does not expand immediately across all possible environments. It expands from the conditions that remain viable, from the regions where continuity has been maintained. These regions may act as sources from which human populations slowly spread into surrounding areas as conditions allow. The pace of this spread would depend on many factors, including the stability of the environment, the availability of resources, and the ability of groups to move without losing continuity in the process. Movement after a period of stress is not the same as movement in a stable world. It is shaped by memory of difficulty, by the limits revealed through previous hardship, and by the need to avoid repeating patterns that led to vulnerability. In this sense, recovery is not simply a return to earlier conditions. It is a continuation under altered circumstances, where the species carries forward both its resilience and the constraints that were revealed during the period of narrowing. Archaeological patterns sometimes suggest expansions or shifts in human presence following periods of environmental change, though these patterns are often complex and regionally varied. What matters is that continuity, once maintained, allows for the gradual reoccupation of space, even if that process is uneven and slow. Some areas may become habitable again and support repeated return. Others may remain difficult, limiting the extent to which human groups can move into them. Over time, this process can lead to an increase in population size and distribution, but that increase is built upon the surviving lines that passed through the earlier period of constraint. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations did experience a narrowing influenced in part by environmental disruption, then the period that followed would have been shaped by how those surviving groups re-established stability. Their movement, their use of resources, and their patterns of cooperation would reflect both inherited knowledge and the adjustments made during more difficult times. This is why recovery must be understood as part of the same story as survival. It is not separate from the pressures that came before. It is a continuation that depends on what remained possible after those pressures were absorbed. The species that continued into later periods would therefore be shaped not only by the fact that it survived, but by the conditions under which it survived. Those conditions would influence where humans could go next, how they could live in those places, and how they could maintain continuity across future generations. In this way, the aftermath of a potential near extinction is not a simple return to normal. It is the beginning of a new phase of the same long process, in which human life continues within the limits that have been revealed by earlier events. What recovery means for a species like ours is not that the world becomes easy again, but that enough patterns become reliable enough for continuity to grow less fragile than before. For early humans, this would have depended on the return of a certain ecological rhythm, not necessarily the same rhythm that had existed earlier, but one that the body and the group could begin to read with some confidence. Water sources that remained available through repeating seasons, plant cycles that could once again be anticipated, and animal movements that became regular enough to support planning would all reduce the cost of staying alive. This reduction in cost matters because survival under severe pressure often consumes nearly all available energy. When conditions ease, even slightly, energy can be directed not only toward immediate endurance, but toward the slower work of maintaining a group across time. Adults recover more fully, children are supported with greater consistency, movement becomes less desperate, and memory regains some of its usefulness because the environment behaves in ways that can be learned and repeated. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this kind of easing would have been essential if the species was to persist beyond a narrow phase. A population that has been reduced or strained cannot expand simply because danger has passed. It needs conditions that support repeated success over many seasons and many generations. This is why the aftermath of a possible bottleneck must be imagined as gradual. The surviving groups would still have been small. They would still have depended on local ecological knowledge and on cooperation within limited social worlds. But if some regions began to offer a more stable balance between effort and return, then those groups could begin to sustain themselves with a margin slightly wider than before. That wider margin is where continuity strengthens. It allows not only survival but renewal. Births can be carried through with greater likelihood of success. Children can reach maturity in environments that do not constantly threaten the group's basic cohesion. Injuries and illness, though still dangerous, no longer arrive in a setting where every reserve has already been exhausted. Over time, such conditions make it possible for populations to become less thinly stretched, and for human presence to extend with more confidence into surrounding areas. Yet even this should not be imagined as a simple expansion across empty or welcoming space. Recovery remains shaped by the same limits that defined earlier vulnerability. Movement still costs energy. New environments still carry uncertainty. Social bonds still need to be maintained. What changes is that some groups may have been able to move from a state of constant narrowing into one of cautious persistence. Archaeological patterns from later periods often suggest shifts in occupation and human spread that do not happen all at once, which is consistent with a species recovering unevenly rather than dramatically. Around 74,000 years ago, if the human future depended on a relatively small number of surviving lines, then the world that followed would have been rebuilt from those lines alone. Every later continuity would depend on whether those groups could re-establish enough stability to carry life further into time. In this sense, recovery is inseparable from survival because a species does not truly continue by merely remaining present for another year or another decade. It continues when that presence becomes durable enough to reproduce itself without constantly falling back toward the edge. The significance of this stage is that it reveals how little is required for a species to begin expanding again, but also how much must quietly work together for that expansion to hold. Body, landscape, cooperation, and time must all come back into partial alignment. If they do, what once seemed close to disappearance can slowly become continuity again. If they do not, then survival remains temporary. The human story after a narrow point, therefore, is not one of sudden triumph. It is a slow reweaving of life in places where the world once again becomes just stable enough for fragile lines to keep extending into the future. The long continuation of the species after a narrow period would not have depended on one dramatic recovery, but on whether enough surviving groups could slowly turn persistence into durability. This is a quieter process than the word recovery often suggests. It does not begin with abundance. It begins when the world stops taking quite so much away. A landscape does not need to become generous for human continuity to strengthen. It only needs to become readable again. Water must remain in enough places for movement to make sense. Food must return often enough that effort is not constantly wasted. Seasonal patterns must regain enough consistency that memory can guide action instead of leading it into failure. For early humans, whose survival always depended on the close fit between body, environment, and shared knowledge, this kind of partial stability would have made the difference between a population that merely lingers and one that can slowly extend itself forward. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, that extension would still have been fragile. Groups would remain small, and the human body would remain the same body that had already revealed its limits under pressure. Children would still require long care. Adults would still depend on cooperation and repeated success in finding food and water. Illness, injury, and environmental change would still threaten continuity. Yet, if the conditions in some regions became less severe, even slightly, then the cost of carrying life through time would also become less severe. This reduction in cost matters more than abundance, because small populations recover through margin, not through sudden surplus. A little more predictability in rainfall, a little more regularity in animal movement, a little more ecological diversity in the places people could reach. All of these would widen the narrow space in which families and groups could continue. Once that space widens even modestly, the future becomes easier to hold. More children survive into maturity. More adults retain enough strength to keep moving, teaching, and caring. Social bonds do not break as easily under repeated strain. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next becomes useful again because the environment once more resembles something that can be remembered. This is how continuity becomes stronger. Not through a break with the past, but through the gradual reappearance of conditions under which the ordinary tasks of being human no longer fail so often. Over many generations, such conditions could allow surviving groups to spread outward, not as conquerors of a transformed world, but as small lines of life entering spaces that had become workable again. The pace would be slow and the process uneven. Some regions may have supported repeated return and stable occupation. Others may have remained too uncertain, too dry, too cold, or too ecologically thin to hold people for long. What matters is that the species did not need all places to recover at once. It only needed enough places, in enough different regions, for continuity to stop narrowing and begin extending again. This helps explain why the aftermath of a possible near extinction would leave no single dramatic mark announcing that humanity had recovered. The change would be demographic before it was visible. It would exist in the fact that some local lines no longer ended as often, that some groups could remain in place longer, that movement increasingly led to continuation rather than disappearance. The human world that emerged afterward would still carry the consequences of what had been lost. It would still be built from fewer surviving lines than before. But once those lines found conditions under which they could persist with slightly greater stability, the future of the species would no longer depend only on avoiding immediate collapse. It would begin to depend on something quieter and more powerful, the repeated success of ordinary life. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations did pass through such a narrow period, then what followed may have been shaped not by one triumphant escape, but by the slow return of enough environmental reliability for fragile human continuity to become durable again. That durability, once re-established, may have been the real beginning of everything that came later. The humans who lived through this period would not have known that later ages might look back and ask whether their species had come close to disappearing. They had no way to see themselves as part of a single global population, no way to measure how many other groups still remained, and no way to compare their local hardship with conditions far beyond the landscapes they could reach. Their world was immediate, bounded by water, food, weather, memory, and the people with whom they moved. This matters because it changes how survival should be imagined. It was not the survival of a species that understood itself as a species. It was the survival of many small groups continuing ordinary life under conditions they did not choose and could not fully interpret. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this would have been true in a very deep sense. A group could experience colder air, thinner food returns, longer movement between usable places, or the gradual failure of familiar patterns without ever knowing whether the same was happening elsewhere. They would respond locally, through decisions shaped by the body and by memory, not through any larger awareness of what was happening to humanity as a whole. This means that continuity was maintained without total knowledge. The chain that carried the species forward was made of local acts, keeping a child alive through another difficult season, finding enough water to remain in one place a little longer, deciding when to move and when to stay, sharing food when returns were uncertain, remembering a route that still worked when others had begun to fail. None of these acts would have felt historic. They would have felt necessary, immediate, and incomplete. Yet from the perspective of deep time, this is exactly how species-level survival happens. Not through a single grand intention, but through repeated local continuities that remain unbroken long enough for the future to continue. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations were indeed passing through a narrower phase, then this ignorance is part of the story, not a detail outside it. Humans survived not because they knew the scale of the danger, but because some groups continued to function within it. Their knowledge was narrow in range but highly relevant to the world they actually inhabited. They knew where water had once been found, how seasons usually shifted, what kinds of food could still be gathered when familiar options became unreliable, how to protect warmth and how to hold a group together when effort returned less than before. This local knowledge could not reveal the condition of the whole species, but it did not need to. Species do not continue because individuals possess a complete understanding of their own history. They continue because enough ordinary knowledge remains useful in enough places to carry bodies and relationships across time. The beginning of humanity was shaped in this way, not by a view from above, but by life lived close to the ground, where each decision was made within immediate limits. This also helps explain why near extinction, if something like it occurred, would have left no clear human memory. It would not have been experienced as a single story. It would have been distributed across many places, many groups, and many unequal circumstances. Some would have faced harder conditions, others less severe ones. Some lines would have ended without any wider witness, and others would have continued without knowing what had been lost elsewhere. In that sense, the survival of our species may have depended on a form of continuity that was blind to itself. Human beings carried the future forward without being able to see how narrow that future may have become. The body still needed warmth and food. Children still needed care. The group still needed cooperation. The environment still had to remain just workable enough for memory and effort to matter. If those things held together in some places, then the species continued, even though no one could have known how much rested on such ordinary acts. This is one of the quietest truths in the whole story. Humanity may have remained not because it saw the danger clearly, but because, in scattered parts of the world, people kept doing the small and necessary things that allowed life to go on, without ever knowing how close the wider human line may have come to thinning beyond return. What humans carried through this period was therefore not certainty, but continuity without full understanding. This is an important distinction, because from a modern point of view it is easy to imagine survival as something guided by awareness, by a clear recognition that danger exists, and that action must be taken to preserve the future. Early humans did not have that kind of perspective. They did not know whether the patterns around them were part of a short disturbance or a deeper change. They could not compare the condition of one region to another across great distances. They could not know whether human groups elsewhere were thriving, struggling, or disappearing. Their knowledge was local, embodied, and immediate. It came through repeated experience of weather, movement, food, water, birth, illness, and loss. Yet this limited knowledge was not a weakness in the simple sense. It was the only kind of knowledge that could matter directly in the world they inhabited. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, survival depended less on broad explanation than on whether familiar signals could still be read well enough to guide action. A slight change in wind, the altered timing of rain, the absence of animals along a route once used before, the slower return of edible plants, the growing difficulty of keeping children nourished through a difficult season, these were the signs through which change would have been felt. None of them announced themselves as part of a species-wide crisis. They arrived as local problems that had to be managed with the tools available at that moment. In that sense, human continuity was built from fragments of understanding rather than from a complete picture. This matters because it shows that the species may have survived not through any singular insight, but through the repeated success of small adjustments made in the absence of certainty. A group might move slightly earlier than usual because water had become less reliable. Another might remain in one place longer because a nearby food source still held. Another might redistribute labor differently when one season demanded more movement than expected. These decisions would not have been made as contributions to the future of humanity. They would have been made because immediate life required them. And yet, over time, those ordinary responses could determine whether a line continued or ended. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations were indeed under pressure from a changing environment, and possibly from the effects of the Toba eruption in some regions, then the future of the species may have depended on exactly this kind of narrow but practical intelligence. The people who remained would not have done so by mastering the whole situation. They would have remained because enough of what they knew still worked, or could still be modified, within the environments they faced. This also helps explain why the archaeological record is often quiet about crisis. Stone tools, occupation traces, and environmental evidence can show continuity or interruption, but they do not show the inner scale on which survival was experienced. They do not show how uncertainty entered daily life, how incomplete knowledge shaped movement, or how many decisions were made without knowing whether they would lead to continuity or loss. The beginning of our species must therefore be imagined not as a story of heroic understanding, but as one of partial knowledge meeting real pressure. Human beings continued while seeing only what was near them. They carried memory, skill, and social care across a world they could not fully map. In a scattered species, that may have been enough. Not enough to remove danger, not enough to preserve every line, and not enough to understand the full meaning of what was happening, but enough in some places for continuity to keep moving forward. This is one of the deepest reasons the story remained so quiet. The human future may have depended on people who never knew they were protecting it. They only knew they had to get through another season, keep warmth through another night, and hold together long enough for children to live into the next cycle. From that narrow horizon, the species continued, and that continuation, though blind to itself, may have been the most important thing of all. What this means, in the quietest sense, is that the human future may have depended on people who never knew they were standing inside a narrow passage of history. They could not have seen themselves from above. They could not have counted distant groups, measured genetic diversity, or guessed that later humans might ask whether the species had come close to disappearing. Their lives would have unfolded within immediate limits. The distance to water, the reliability of food, the strength of the group, the condition of children, the memory of a route, the feel of a season becoming less familiar than before. In such a world, survival was not guided by an abstract desire to preserve humanity. It was guided by the much smaller and more urgent work of remaining alive in one place for one more cycle. This changes the emotional shape of the story. It removes the idea of conscious rescue and replaces it with something more ordinary and more fragile. The line continued because, in at least some regions, enough practical knowledge still held. A group still knew how to find shelter from cold or rain. Someone still remembered where usable water might remain when nearby sources failed. Adults still shared enough labor that children could be protected through another difficult stretch. Fire was still kept, movement still judged, food still divided, and social bonds still maintained well enough that everyday life did not completely break apart. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this kind of ordinary continuity may have mattered more than any single dramatic adaptation. The people who remained did not need a complete explanation of the forces acting on them. They only needed enough of their learned world to remain workable. This is important because it helps explain how a species can survive a difficult period without ever turning that survival into a unified event. The process remains scattered. One group succeeds in holding together while another, perhaps not very far away, loses continuity. One landscape still gives enough return to justify staying. Another becomes too uncertain to trust. One memory still guides action correctly. Another begins to describe a world that no longer behaves the same way. From the perspective of later science, these differences may appear as environmental variation, demographic structure, or uneven local resilience. But from inside the lives of the people themselves, they would have appeared only as immediate conditions becoming either manageable or unmanageable. This helps explain why so much of the story must remain quiet. Near extinction, if something like it occurred, would not have announced itself to those living through it. It would have been distributed across many local experiences, most of them small in scale, most of them focused on the present rather than the future. And yet this does not make the process less significant. It may make it more human. The beginning of our species was not secured by full awareness, but by the ability of some groups to continue doing what human beings do under pressure: to observe, to adjust, to remember, to care, and to remain together long enough for another generation to take shape. Around 74,000 years ago, if the wider human world was indeed narrower than before, then this narrow, practical continuity may have been the real substance of survival. Not grand foresight, not certainty, and not a universal victory, but the repeated success of local acts that did not fail all at once. A mother keeping a child warm, a group deciding to move before a place had fully emptied of value, someone noticing that an older route still held promise when newer attempts had failed, others sharing labor when one body could no longer manage alone. These are not events that appear heroic from a distance, yet they may be exactly the kinds of acts from which species-level continuity is built. The human line may have remained because enough people, in enough places, continued to solve the next immediate problem without ever knowing how much depended on their doing so. In that sense, the future of humanity may have passed through hands that never knew they were holding it, and through ordinary days that carried far more history than anyone living them could possibly have seen. The deeper meaning of this story is not only that humans may have survived a dangerous period, but that their existence was never guaranteed in the first place. It is easy, from the present, to imagine that the appearance of our species made our continuation somehow inevitable, as if once Homo sapiens emerged, the future already belonged to us. But the earlier parts of this history suggest something much quieter and less certain. A species can exist and still remain fragile. It can spread across landscapes and still depend on a small number of local continuities. It can possess intelligence, cooperation, memory, and flexibility, yet still live very close to the edge created by food, water, temperature, distance, and the slow limits of the body. Around the beginning of our species, all of these conditions were already in place. Human populations were not large enough, dense enough, or stable enough to remove uncertainty from their future. They remained scattered, dependent on environments that could change beyond what earlier knowledge had prepared them to handle. In such a world, survival was never the default condition. It had to be maintained again and again, through repeated success across generations, under circumstances that could never be fully controlled. This is why the period around 74,000 years ago matters, even if many details remain debated. Whether the narrowing of human continuity at that time was severe, moderate, gradual, or uneven, the possibility itself reveals something fundamental. It reveals that humanity was not moving through history with any built-in guarantee of endurance. The line that leads from early humans to the present may have depended on a relatively small number of groups remaining in places where continuity was still possible, while many other lines may have thinned or ended without leaving descendants. This does not mean that humans were uniquely weak. It means they were alive in the way all species are alive, exposed to conditions larger than themselves, dependent on local success, and always more vulnerable than later stories of survival tend to admit. Around the early spread of Homo sapiens, this vulnerability would have been especially important because so much of human life depended on long childhood, cooperative care, slow reproduction, and the transfer of memory across time. These are powerful traits under the right conditions, but they also mean that continuity can be interrupted more easily when the environment grows less stable. A species like ours does not disappear only when bodies fail. It can also narrow when too many small lines stop extending into the next generation. That is why the question of near extinction is not merely about catastrophe. It is about contingency. It is about how much of the human future depended on conditions that did not have to remain favorable, on habitats that did not have to stay usable, on social structures that did not have to hold, and on bodies that could not rapidly become something else when the world changed. Seen from this angle, the origin of humanity is not a triumphant beginning that naturally leads to the present. It is a fragile beginning that remained open to interruption for a very long time. Even after a difficult period passed, the species that continued would still have been shaped by what had been lost, by what had narrowed, and by the fact that continuity had survived only under certain conditions and not others. This makes the human story both smaller and more real. Smaller, because it removes the illusion that our presence was guaranteed. More real, because it shows that the future was held together by ordinary survival repeated across time, not by destiny. Around 74,000 years ago, if the human line truly passed through a narrow interval, then what survived was not proof that humanity was meant to endure. It was proof only that enough continuity remained for the story not to end there, and that may be one of the most important truths hidden inside this distant period. That being human has always meant living inside a future that was never promised, and continuing only because, in enough places, the fragile chain between body, environment, memory, and care did not fully break. If the human future was never guaranteed, then what continues into the present is not simply the result of strength, but the result of alignment. Body, environment, and social life had to fit together well enough, often only barely, for continuity to hold. When that alignment loosened even slightly, the cost of being human increased. When it held, even under pressure, life could extend itself into another generation. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this alignment was never permanent. It had to be maintained within changing conditions, across landscapes that did not remain stable, and through bodies that could not quickly become something else. This is why survival should not be imagined as a single achievement that, once reached, secured the future. It was a repeated condition, fragile and temporary, that had to be restored again and again. The period around 74,000 years ago makes this especially clear, because it sits at the intersection of environmental change, possible volcanic disturbance, and small, scattered human populations. In such a setting, the question is not why humans survived as if survival were expected. The question is how alignment was maintained in enough places for continuity to continue. Some regions may have remained within a range that the human body could still manage. Some groups may have retained enough ecological knowledge to adjust their movement and resource use. Some social structures may have held together under strain, distributing effort and care in ways that allowed children to reach maturity. These conditions did not have to exist everywhere. They only had to exist somewhere and persist long enough for the chain of generations not to break entirely. This way of thinking also changes how loss is understood. The lines that did not continue were not necessarily weaker or less capable in any simple sense. They may have faced slightly harsher conditions, slightly worse timing, or slightly less favourable ecological combinations. In a narrow world, small differences can lead to different outcomes. Over time, those differences shape which human lines remain and which do not. What continues into the future is therefore not a perfect representation of what once existed, but a subset shaped by where alignment held and where it did not. Around the origin of our species, this means that the human story is built not only from persistence, but from the absence of many paths that could not be carried forward. This is not a failure of the species. It is a reflection of how life operates under constraint. Every species exists within limits, and when those limits are pressed, continuity becomes selective, even if no one living through the process can see it that way. The significance of this idea lies in how it reframes survival. It is no longer a simple narrative of overcoming a single great danger. It becomes a long sequence of moments in which life either fits its conditions or does not. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations were indeed close to a narrower state, then the future of the species depended on this fit holding in enough places at once. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but sufficiently. This also helps explain why the story remains quiet in the archaeological record. Alignment does not leave a single dramatic trace. It leaves continuity, and continuity appears as presence, rather than as event. The absence of presence, by contrast, leaves little to be seen. Yet the balance between the two may have determined everything that followed. The humans who lived through that period did not know they were maintaining alignment at a scale larger than their own lives. They only knew that certain places still worked, that certain movements still led to return, and that certain patterns still allowed life to continue. From those local successes, the larger continuity of the species emerged. In that sense, the human future was not secured once. It was assembled, slowly and unevenly, from many small alignments that held just long enough for time to keep moving forward. What remains after such a history is not a simple lesson about triumph, but a quieter recognition that human continuity was always conditional. The species did not move from its beginning to the present along a secure path. It moved through a world that repeatedly tested whether the conditions necessary for human life could remain connected long enough to support another generation. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, that connection depended on many things staying within a narrow, workable range at once. The body had to find enough food and water. The climate had to remain tolerable enough for movement and recovery. The landscape had to stay legible enough for memory to guide action. Social bonds had to remain strong enough for children, the injured, and the vulnerable to be carried through difficult stretches. If any one of these weakened too far, continuity itself could begin to narrow. This is why the period around 74,000 years ago continues to matter, even though the precise scale of human reduction at that time remains debated. The value of the question lies not only in whether humanity came close to extinction in a numerical sense, but in what the possibility reveals about the nature of our existence. It reveals that the future of our species was not guaranteed by intelligence alone, nor by adaptability alone, nor by any single trait that made survival inevitable. It depended on repeated fits between human life and the world around it, fits that could hold in some places and fail in others. Around the beginning of our species, this would have meant that continuity was always uneven. Some human lines continued because the places they occupied remained just stable enough, or because their social life remained just cohesive enough, or because the timing of stress did not coincide with their most vulnerable moment. Other lines, facing slightly different conditions, may not have continued at all. Over long periods, this produced the human world that later emerged, not as the full expression of every early possibility, but as the continuation of those possibilities that remained compatible with survival under the conditions that actually existed. This way of seeing the story removes the illusion that our presence today proves that the human future was somehow written in advance. Instead, it suggests that what survives does so because enough local continuities hold, and because those continuities are not all lost at once. The species remains not by escaping contingency, but by passing through it repeatedly. This is a more fragile understanding of humanity, but also a more truthful one. It places human existence back inside the larger logic of life on Earth, where persistence depends not on destiny, but on whether body, environment, and care can remain linked across time. Around 74,000 years ago, if those links narrowed sharply, then the continuation of our species would have depended on a relatively small number of surviving paths not fully breaking. What followed afterward would not erase that fragility. It would carry it forward. Even later expansions of human life into new landscapes would still be built upon a history in which continuity had once been vulnerable to interruption. This does not make the human story less meaningful, it makes it more exact. It reminds us that being human has never meant standing outside risk. It has meant living within limits, adjusting where adjustment was possible, enduring where endurance was necessary, and continuing only where enough of the ordinary foundations of life remained intact. In that sense, the deepest truth left by this distant period may be that humanity was never a certainty waiting to unfold. It was, and perhaps still is, a continuity assembled from conditions that do not have to hold forever, from relationships that can weaken, and from generations that depend on the fragile success of those before them. The line continued, but not because it had to. It continued because, in enough places, the world did not fully close, and because enough human lives remained connected long enough for the future to keep taking shape. At the end of this long reflection, the question is no longer only about what happened 74,000 years ago, but about how such a possibility changes the way we understand ourselves now. The idea that humans may have passed through a narrow point in their history does not need to be confirmed in every detail to carry meaning. It suggests that the line connecting the past to the present was not always wide, not always secure, and not always certain to continue. What exists today may rest on a continuity that, at times, depended on relatively few surviving paths. This does not make the present fragile in the same way, but it does place human existence within a longer pattern of dependence on conditions that must hold together for life to continue. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, those conditions were simple in form but difficult in practice. The body required regular nourishment, stable temperature, rest, and recovery. The group required cooperation, memory, and care. The environment needed to remain just predictable enough for those requirements to be met. If any part of that arrangement weakened too far, continuity could narrow. If enough parts held, even imperfectly, continuity could extend into the next generation. This pattern has not entirely disappeared. It has changed in scale and form, but the basic relationship between human life and the conditions that support it remains. The difference is that those conditions are now shaped in ways that early humans could not have imagined, and the distance between cause and effect has become harder to see. Yet the underlying structure remains similar. Human life still depends on the alignment between body, environment, and social organization, even if that alignment is now mediated through systems far more complex than those of the distant past. The story of a possible near extinction therefore does not stand apart from the present. It offers a way of seeing continuity itself as something that is maintained rather than guaranteed. It suggests that the future of any species, including our own, depends on whether the conditions that support life remain within a range that can be managed across generations. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations came close to a narrowing, then the continuation of the species may have depended on a small number of groups maintaining that alignment under pressure. What followed afterward was not a complete transformation, but a gradual extension of those surviving lines into a wider future. The significance of this is not in the drama of the past, but in the quiet implication it carries. It reminds us that human existence has always been contingent on relationships that can weaken, on environments that can change, and on bodies that cannot simply become something else when conditions shift. It also reminds us that continuity is built from ordinary processes repeated across time, not from single decisive moments. The people who lived through that distant period did not preserve humanity through a single act. They did so by continuing to live, to care, to move, and to adapt within the limits they faced. In that sense, the human story does not begin with certainty and move toward complexity. It begins with uncertainty and continues through it. The future that followed was not the only possible outcome, but it is the one that remained, and that remaining, quiet and incomplete, is what we now call human history. If the story is followed to its quiet end, what remains is not a single explanation but a change in how human continuity is understood. The question of near extinction does not require a final answer to be meaningful. It opens a space in which the human past can be seen without the assumption that survival was inevitable. Around the early history of Homo sapiens, this matters because it brings attention back to the conditions that made continuation possible in the first place. The body, with its slow rhythms and limited reserves, could only function within a certain range. The environment, with its shifting climates and uneven resources, did not always stay within that range. Social life, with its dependence on cooperation and long childhood, required stability that could not always be guaranteed. When these elements aligned, continuity held. When they did not, continuity could narrow or break. This pattern is not confined to a single moment in the past. It is a general feature of life, visible in different forms across many species and many times. The human case becomes especially visible because the possibility of a narrow interval remains close enough in time to be studied, yet distant enough that it must be approached with caution. Around 74,000 years ago, if human populations were indeed reduced or strained, the meaning of that period lies less in its exact scale and more in what it reveals about dependence. It reveals that the future of a species can rest on conditions that are neither fully stable nor fully controllable. It reveals that survival is not a permanent state but a repeated achievement, maintained through the ongoing fit between life and its surroundings. It also reveals that much of what determines continuity happens without full awareness. Early humans did not need to understand the global condition of their species to contribute to its survival. They only needed to remain within the narrow band of conditions that allowed life to continue where they were. From those local continuities, the larger continuity of the species emerged. This perspective changes how the present can be viewed. It does not suggest that modern humans face the same conditions as those of the distant past. The scale, complexity, and interconnectedness of the world have changed. But the underlying principle remains. Human life still depends on systems that must remain within certain limits. Food, water, climate stability, and social organization continue to shape whether continuity can be maintained across generations. The difference is that these systems now operate at a scale that is both broader and more difficult to perceive directly. This makes the lesson of the distant past neither simple nor immediate, but it does make it relevant. It suggests that the human future, like the human past, is shaped by alignment rather than certainty. It suggests that continuity is not something that, once secured, remains indefinitely. It must be maintained, even if the forms of that maintenance have changed. The people who lived through earlier periods did not know this in an abstract sense, but they lived within it. They adjusted to changing conditions, held their groups together, and carried life forward without any assurance that the future would remain open. That same structure, though transformed, still underlies human existence. The story of a possible near extinction, therefore, does not end in the past. It continues as a way of understanding how life persists, how it narrows, and how it extends again. It leaves a quiet question rather than a final conclusion, one that does not ask for a simple answer but for a different way of seeing. If human continuity has always depended on conditions that can shift, on bodies that cannot quickly change, and on relationships that must hold across time, then what does it mean to say that the future will continue in the same way it has so far? What remains at the end of this question is not the image of a species triumphing over the world, but the image of a species that continued only because enough of the ordinary foundations of life did not fail at the same time. Around 74,000 years ago, humans may have passed through a period in which the future narrowed, whether sharply or unevenly, whether through volcanic disturbance, climatic pressure, population structure, or some combination that can no longer be separated with complete certainty. The exact scale may remain debated, but the deeper meaning is already clear enough. Human continuity was not something guaranteed by intelligence alone, nor by strength alone, nor by any hidden destiny carrying the species safely forward. It depended on bodies that could still find enough food and water, on landscapes that remained just legible enough to move through, on social bonds that held long enough for children to survive, and on memory that still matched the world closely enough to guide action. If those things held together in enough places, the species continued. If they failed in too many places at once, the line could narrow towards silence. This makes the human story quieter than many later versions of it. We are used to telling history through victories, discoveries, and expansions, yet much of what allowed human life to continue may have been far smaller than that. A group finding water where another group could not. A season turning out to be slightly less harsh than expected. A place remaining ecologically mixed enough to support more than one form of nourishment. Adults remaining healthy long enough to protect children through another cycle. None of these things would have felt like the preservation of humanity. They would have felt like one more difficult day being carried into the next. And yet, that may be exactly what continuity is. Not a grand achievement recognized in its own time, but the repeated success of ordinary life under conditions that do not promise success in advance. This is where the question becomes larger than the eruption at Toba, larger even than the debate over bottlenecks. It becomes a question about the structure of human existence itself. To be human has always meant depending on a narrow set of alignments between body, environment, and care. We survive through relationships, through memory, through cooperation, and through the slow carrying of one generation by the previous one. When those links hold, history continues. When they weaken too far, history narrows, sometimes without any single visible moment announcing that narrowing. There is something instructive in that. It teaches that human life is not built mainly on certainty. It is built on maintenance. It is built on the continuing work of keeping the conditions of life connected across time. This does not make the story hopeless. It makes it honest. It places our species back inside the larger fabric of life, where continuation is never fully abstract and never fully automatic. The value of remembering this is not to create fear, but to create proportion. The present can feel permanent because we live inside systems that often hide their fragility. Deep history offers a calmer view. It suggests that continuity has always been real but never effortless, durable but never guaranteed, extended but only through the care and constraints of ordinary existence. If humans almost went extinct 74,000 years ago, then the most important lesson may be that the future was preserved not by certainty, but by enough life remaining workable in enough places for one more generation to follow another. And if that has always been true, then perhaps the deepest question is not how humanity once escaped disappearance, but how any human future is ever held open at all.